Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans and you're watching the John Cedars channel from the bunker. Now, many of you will remember that towards the end of October, beginning of November, I did a series of live streams with some friends of mine, namely Cliff Henderson or XJW Fifth, Mark O'Donnell and Sherry D'Souza, and together we explored this book, Shepherd the Flock of God, which is the very secretive elders only manual that only elders are allowed to read and that ordinary rank and file witnesses don't have access to. And the purpose of our live streams were basically to go through the material, explore it in detail and highlight some of the clearest examples of double standards, of loopholes, of things that just don't make any sense at all. Now, because this is a very thick book, in fact, the book runs to about 274 pages in thickness, the live streams were very long. In fact, if you were to watch them back to back, you'd need over 10.5 hours in total. So I thought it would be good to condense some of the main talking points into one video. Now, I understand that this video is still 3 hours long, but 3 hours is hopefully better than having to set aside 10.5 hours. And maybe it's handy as well just to have everything in one video. I don't know. I hope it's useful. And without further ado, these are my highlights from the live streams reviewing the Shepherd book. But this is the introduction to the Shepherd book. And you can see there in point 3, this publication is copyrighted and confidential. It is issued to each appointed elder. If an elder is deleted for reasons other than moving to another congregation with a favorable recommendation, he should turn over this publication to the Congregation Service Committee to be destroyed, and any electronic copies in his possession should be deleted. This is a book, as a cat walks past Mark, that you are not allowed to have in your possession unless you're an elder.
It's a great point, Lloyd, that the average rank and file publisher, male or female, can't see the book, especially women. And the reality is, I think that there probably are some who might pick up a copy off of their husband's shelf if he puts it on a shelf, or maybe even sees it in his briefcase or sees some open papers. It's a real culture of secrecy. And what I find interesting is that the religion is supposed to be entirely based upon the Bible and Bible principles. And everything in the Bible that the Jehovah's Witnesses use is open to the public, open to everyone, including children. And yet we have so many documents, not just this elder's manual, but we have the branch organization manual and hundreds of other manuals and letters that not even congregation elders will ever see.
Sherry, I'm interested in your thoughts on this particular section. Well, let's read it from the beginning. Only exemplary individuals who read very well should be approved by the body of elders as paragraph readers. If no brothers meet these qualifications, then qualified sisters may be used.
Yeah, that's nice. Thanks. They've got this insistence on preferring live readers versus using audio recordings on jw.org. So I was trying to get back into the mindset to work out why you would, if you don't have a brother, why you just wouldn't go to audio recordings. Are they just dangling a carrot? What? I don't get that.
So you're saying since they don't actually have to have the paragraphs read, why are sisters even being mooted as a potential? Yeah,
yes,
that's a good point. So let's plunge headfirst into appointment and deletion of elders and ministerial servants. And with this, how would you describe this chapter, Sherry?
Oh, headache inducing and very triggering.
So we then have here this fascinating paragraph. I'm not going to read it, but it's on whether the candidate was separated or unscripturally divorced. And this, again, I mean, if you know anything about the circumstances, the private life, shall we say, of Charles Taze Russell and Joseph F. Rutherford, and you read this paragraph, you would very quickly conclude that both would have a hard time qualifying as elders based on what the requirements are in the 21st century, because both Charles Taze Russell and J.F. Rutherford were separated from their spouses, and there were question marks over, certainly in the case of Rutherford, when it came to, the extent he was involved with other women. But it's just astonishing, Sherry, how it's one rule for the way things are today, but again, based on these rules, arguably the religion would never have come to exist.
Yes, no, I totally agree with how you've summarized that. It's just that paragraph, all of those questions, they're so invasive. They don't allow for where two emotionally intelligent adults have agreed to separate mutually. No, someone has to be to blame, and they have to pry into circumstances. What is the brother doing to reconcile? Is the mate unwilling? Like, it's just...
That's a good point.
That to madness. It's just, they have no right to this.
Now, I was referring earlier to references to or subtle nods to the gossip culture. So you have here, for example, let's see here. Does he continue to have the respect and confidence of the congregation as an exemplary family head? And the similar wording in the next paragraph, where it says, and this is to do with a disfellowshipped or disassociated family member that's moved into his home. Is the congregation disturbed by the brother's decision? Have a number lost respect for him? And it just got me to thinking, Sherry, are they planning on doing like a survey? How do they determine what the mood is in the congregation? Are they literally going around and saying, what do you think about this? This seems to me to be an entirely subjective determination when trying to figure out the extent to which a congregation respects someone or how they feel about a certain situation.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. It absolutely is listening to the gossip culture, what's happening. And when you think about 23, the whole subject of that, this is situations that would require a review of an appointed brother's qualifications. So if he has allowed a disfellowshipped or disassociated family member to move into his home. Now, there can be any number of reasons why, but how are they likely to find that out? It's not like an appointed man's going to say, hey, I've had my disfellowship so-and-so come back. This is gossip culture. You can just hear how the congregation is going to be talking about something like this and the judgment. But how dare the organisation put themselves into what is a family arrangement? That is family. This is all tied up with shunning and all the rest, I know, but it's just, I find that so offensive.
Questions about an appointed brother's qualifications would result if he encouraged or gave unspoken approval to such a marriage. For example, by supporting the courtship or by supporting, attending, or participating in the wedding or wedding reception. A brother's qualifications should also be reviewed if he did not get involved personally, but allowed his wife or others in his household to do so. This, for me, is just screaming, control your wife.
Oh, it absolutely is. And we actually had this happen. One of my cousins was marrying an unbaptized man who later became baptized, I think within 18 months. And I'm very close to this particular cousin. Sasha was a servant at the time, and we were invited to the wedding. And I really agonized over attending. And it's ridiculous. We should have been able to go. But we were told, no, if we went, it would call into question such as qualifications as a servant. I remember feeling so torn over that whole situation. It just, and even more so because after the wedding, what you can then associate with them, because now they're married. So what's the difference? What does it really matter? It caused quite a lot of cognitive dissonance for me at the time, and I felt terrible about telling my cousin that I couldn't go because she was marrying someone who wasn't baptized. And now, of course, the irony is I'm now shunned by her.
Of course, yeah.
in reverse situation. This was definitely a paragraph that I struggled with.
I can imagine. It was triggering for you.
Very much so.
And in the next paragraph, we have the don't ask, don't tell policy.
Yes,
which is
that's right.
Just wonderful. I mean, well, I say wonderful. It's fascinating that you're off the hook if you keep quiet, is what this whole paragraph amounts to. But it's a provision, and in fairness, this same provision has a manifestation for ordinary publishers. But specifically, you could argue in the context of elders, it becomes repugnant to think that an elder could be presiding on a judicial committee and judging over someone and finding them guilty of wrongdoing that results in them being separated from their family, when he's done potentially even the same thing, but gotten away scot-free just because he sat on it.
Yep, exactly. And remembering that one of these qualifications is having freeness of speech. And the hypocrisy, the double standard here is just incredible. And I don't understand that this is all about timing, that you have this more than a few years ago.
Yeah.
And
he has been serving faithfully for many years. Well, that's because no one's known about it but him. Has evidence of God's blessing. Well, that's entirely subjective. And has the respect of the congregation. Gossip culture. Again, are you really going to go around and poll the congregation on whether they respect him or not?
Exactly. That's right.
Slightly chilling here. The sin may involve child sex abuse, which means he would not qualify. And that there, Sherry, is where you put the full stop, which means he would not qualify. But they have to add, because they have to maintain the concept of forgiveness for many years, if ever.
If ever.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hang on. Let me just.
Okay.
There you
go. Yeah, just breathe, Sherry. Breathe, and yeah. So.
Thank you.
So yeah, and you also have here same thing, just these arbitrary and vague time limits. If the wrongdoing occurred within the past few years while he was serving as an elder or a ministerial servant, he is disqualified from serving as such, not being free from accusation. Apparently, whether you're free from accusation or not is dependent on time. And if enough years have gone by, many years, if many years have gone by, whatever that means, you're free from accusation. Yeah.
I do have to mention this one because this was another trigger. Because Sasha was serving as a servant while I was doing a 2-year online course for a diploma with a university that's 600 kilometers away, and I've never even visited, but nonetheless, and we kept that very quiet. But just as I was finishing the diploma, word got out that I was doing this. And true to form, Sasha was spoken to. He was pulled aside, and he was told that I should be pulled into line. None of the elders spoke to me, of course. They've got to speak to my head. They have to speak to Sasha. They questioned him as to whether he was presiding over his house in a fine manner, and that worldly pursuits had taken priority as far as I was concerned. So yeah, this particular one, the fact that I was doing this online course to aid me in my working career, to get a diploma to help me become qualified to do what I was doing at work, called into question his qualifications to serve as a servant. So yeah, this paragraph, it happens. This is mind-blowing, everyone, but this is actually...
So you've lived this paragraph, basically,
is what
you're telling me. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. This is a very odd requirement if you think about it in the context of the kind of doomsday Armageddon aspect of the organization, whereupon everyone who is outside the organization, who isn't a Jehovah's Witness, deserves to die. If there's any question marks over, financial wrongdoing or bankruptcy or anything like that, one of the questions that is supposed to be asked is, does he continue to have a fine testimony from outsiders? And in my book, I've written, outsiders will be destroyed at Armageddon, but their opinion matters.
Yeah.
Doesn't
Apparently
make any sense.
No, it doesn't, does it?
Interesting material on resignation. So let's say you are an elder or a servant, and I don't know, you're a little bit concerned about liability in forthcoming child sex abuse lawsuits, given the fact that Watchtower routinely throws elders under the bus in those situations, and you decide that you want to resign as an elder, which isn't inconceivable that you would want to do that. Frankly, I'd want to resign as an elder after reading this book, but that's just me. So they're supposed to have a conversation with, let's see, with two elders. Two elders should discuss the matter with him. And then it says, if he still feels he wants to resign, sorry, let me select it. If he still feels he wants to resign after this discussion, the Congregation Service Committee should write the circuit overseer and provide full details as to why the brother chose to relinquish his privilege of service. So he might think he's having a personal conversation, but in actual fact, full details are being passed up the chain to the circuit overseer, so that again, private details are being thrown around willy-nilly. Yeah. And then imagine... Yeah, go on.
I thought that particular paragraph, it made me think of PMO elders and PMO ministerial servants, so physically in, mentally out, that we like to refer to. They're really in a conundrum because they don't get to just resign. They have to have a reason for it. Is it because you've done something wrong? Or, what are the reasons? That it really puts them in a very awkward position if, because of what they learn about the organization, especially as you just said before we got to this paragraph about child abuse, you don't want the responsibility of being an elder. How do you navigate this when they're controlling even the way you resign?
Well, the concern I have, Sherry, is that they are treated as though they've done something wrong. And you would think, given how much they have sacrificed over the years, and anyone who reads this book very quickly learns just how much is involved in being an elder, depending on what privileges you get given. But they give all of this time and energy, and then for genuine reasons that have nothing to do with a fault on their part, they feel the need to back away, and that they are treated in these provisions as though they've done something wrong. So let me show you the announcement of deletion. Yes. Announcements of deletion, including those because of resignations, should read as follows. Brother, name of person, is no longer serving as an elder or a ministerial servant. So as far as the congregation is concerned, Sherry, you could have been you haven't resigned necessarily, you've been kicked off.
Yes, exactly. It's exactly the same as their announcement about disfellowshipping and disassociation. You're no longer a Jehovah's Witness. there's so much conjecture that can be put around why.
Records related to the appointment and deletion of elders and ministerial servants should be retained indefinitely. So once you are on Watchtower's radar, I think we've discussed, even if you're just an unbaptized publisher, even if you disassociate and say, I want nothing more to do with this organization, records are kept about you. And especially if you climb high enough to be an elder or servant, there's going to be records kept about you indefinitely.
Yes, except the organization's going to lie about that whenever they can. They will tell authorities that they hold no data. So I'm aware of a few here in Australia who have served as elders and servants, and they have made requests for their data. And Watchtower hasn't complied, of course, and so they've taken their complaint in Australia to the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, who's the independent national regulator for the privacy and freedom of information. And when those complaints have been taken through to their conclusion, what the OAIC ends up telling the individuals that have requested their data is that Watchtower tells the OAIC that there is no data, which is clearly not true, because we're reading here that they keep this information indefinitely about the appointment and deletion of elders and ministerial servants. So theocratic warfare at its best. They lie through their teeth when they need to and are entirely dishonest and deceitful.
Speaking of the rapidity with which, I mean, we were talking about the rapidity with which you can be appointed a servant after just 12 months. If you're a guy, pioneers, the applicant must be baptized for at least a full 6 months. So from baptism pool, 6 months later, you could end up with the cycle repeating itself. Again, it does smack a little bit of desperation from my point of view. Yeah. And there's another thing here which you would really want to know, Sherry, if you were a pioneer, but it's kept from you. So if a regular pioneer reaches at least 800 hours for the year, bearing in mind they have to reach 840, but if they reach at least 800 for the year, hours spent in field service in combination with any hour credit, he may continue to serve as a pioneer. So pioneers think that it's 840, but in actual fact, it's 800.
Yep.
Here's an interesting one, and this for me really kind of highlights how rank obsessed this religion is, Sherry. So it says, in rare circumstances, a brother or sister may be approved to remain as a pioneer without having a minimum hour requirement. This provision is only for exemplary long-time pioneers who have a heartfelt desire to serve always as regular pioneers, and who feel they would be taking a backward step if they had to discontinue, but who are unable to meet the hour requirement because of infirmity. In my notes I've put, I want to keep the title without doing the work.
Yeah, that's exactly right. This is an allowance only for a very special few. It's your Gilead graduates and your missionaries that are given this, but it very much is taking a backward step. That really stood out to me.
Oh, it's a backward step because I'm losing a title. Why is it a back?
Yes.
Get a grip of yourself. If you think that's a backward step, then good grief, what a sheltered life you must have led, you know? It's just astounding how rank obsessed this organization is. And it says here, there is no need to give consideration to allowing an older pioneer who develops health problems to serve as an infirm regular pioneer if he is willing to transfer to the publisher rank. So humility is a disadvantage.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you're humble, you'll be worse off. But if you are rank obsessed, then you're better off. But why would you need a chapter on medical matters in any other religion other than one that involves itself in medical matters, especially when it comes to blood transfusions. I mean,
Yeah.
there's just no need for this, is there really, apart from for that?
Yep. This was a chapter I found very difficult to get through. It's just the complete and utter control that the organisation has to have, down to the minute detail of how you are treated for medical conditions. It's
So obviously witnesses or Watchtower will repeatedly say, or apologists will say, that refusing blood transfusion is a personal decision. Here it says, durable power of attorney card. The publisher should be informed of the importance of having a properly completed DPA card, otherwise known as a blood card, and of providing a copy of it to his healthcare agents and his doctor or hospital. Sherry, we are in section 1 and already there's coercion.
Yep, it hits pretty quickly. But just, knee-jerk reaction, that opening sentence, when the elders learn that a sister is pregnant, they should indicate or inquire whether she has located a cooperative doctor and medical facility that have experience in bloodless medicine. That's their first instinct. It's not, oh, congratulations. No. Have you got it sorted, what doctor you're going to? And
so it goes without saying that, the arrival of a new life in the world should be a joyous time, but instead it's a time for women to be thinking about whether they're falling in line with Watchtower's blood policy. In the first section of paragraph 3, it openly talks about, it says, if they do not have witness family members with them in a hospital, this is the elderly, older brothers and sisters may be particularly vulnerable to intimidation by medical personnel. So it's suggesting here that rather than being intimidated by elders, it's actually the medical personnel who are the bad guys. And in a blatant call for coercion, bearing in mind this is talking about elderly patients, it says elders would do well to encourage such ones to have a duly completed DPA card and remind them to confirm periodically that their designated healthcare agents understand their decisions and will uphold them. So, blatant call here to coerce elderly patients. I found paragraph 4 incredibly disingenuous, because here we have basically the HLC's strategy laid out bare for us, and I wish medical professionals would read this. This is talking about how to get the HLC a foot in the door. When the elders learn that a publisher is being admitted to the hospital, the publisher should be reminded again, that word which means coerced, that if he wishes to receive visits from congregation elders, including members of the patient visitation group, he should inform the hospital that he would welcome a visit from a minister of Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, if you're a hospital staff member and someone says, I'd like a visit from a minister of Jehovah's Witnesses, unless you are well versed on the issue with blood, you're just going to think, oh, they just want spiritual support. But that's clearly not what this is about. And yet here you have clear instructions that are, again, intended to get that foot in the door. And look at the language here. A publisher will want to ensure that a copy of his DPA card is included with his medical records to help ensure that his wishes are honored. A publisher may choose to appoint 2 of Jehovah's Witnesses as his healthcare agents. Their mind is being made up for them.
Yep. And then enforced.
But I found this as well, Sherry, very hypocritical. It is unfair to the medical team when a publisher fails to communicate his wishes well in advance of the surgery. I've put in my notes, I think it's more unfair to the medical team for their efforts to be sabotaged.
Yes, I could not agree more with that comment.
And with the publisher's permission, hospital liaison committee members or others may discuss the publisher's case with medical personnel. Again, they're interfering. And however, it is the responsibility of the patient or his healthcare agents to make healthcare decisions, I've put ... under threat of disassociation for making the wrong decision.
Exactly.
It's so disingenuous what information's left out of here, Sherry.
I totally agree. And it really is like, what choice do you have? You don't really have a choice. It's like the blessing and the malediction. You either choose life or you choose death. You either choose to do things the way Watchtower has dictated, or you suffer the consequences.
I found this, well, frankly, it is kind of hilarious, because they seem to think, Sherry, correct me if I'm wrong, that if they are baptizing someone with a communicable disease such as HIV, hepatitis, and so forth, that this necessitates them being baptized in a stream, river, lake, or sea to be baptized. He may attend the convention or assembly, listen to the baptism talk, and then be baptized in his hotel room or in a private room where there is a large tub that can be used for this purpose. Hopefully there's a suitably stocked minibar nearby. And in point 17, it says, the brothers performing the baptism should be informed of the health issue so as to decide whether this would be a risk that they would be willing to take. Sherry, I've Googled this, and as far as I can tell, you can't catch HIV from a swimming pool.
No, it's not communicable via water.
This is basically the motherlode of do's and don'ts, of rules that affect the lives of Jehovah's Witnesses, because this is the chapter that an elder would turn to when they're trying to decide if something that they've heard a publisher is doing warrants a judicial committee. And when it comes to the list of do's and don'ts, the list of rules that you can have your life turned upside down for violating, this point here I found interesting, because it says, of course, this list is not comprehensive. So you have dozens and dozens of pages outlining in detail all of the things that you can get in trouble for, and they're saying, actually, there might be more.
Right.
But we haven't had time to squeeze that was chilling when I saw those words, you know.
Right. Don't think that these are the only things. You can still disfellowship for other reasons beyond this, you know.
Yeah, we reserve the right to come to you over more or less anything. The mental disposition of the person, we're talking about someone who's been raped. The mental disposition of the person, the circumstances that led up to the incident, and any delay in reporting should be considered. Is this saying, because it seems to me to be saying this, or at least suggesting it, that depending on the circumstances, it might not be rape, and depending on the delay in reporting, it might not be rape? That's what it seems to be suggesting.
I believe that's absolutely what it is suggesting. What it's suggesting, and especially in this era that we're in now, when society is becoming more sensitive to the fact that many times when things like this happen, people may not, for a variety of reasons, be ready to come forward about something immediately, and there may be a delay. There may be a significant delay, and here the elders, who obviously have no training in that aspect of life or society, are being told to kind of police the validity of the person who's coming forward saying that this has happened to them based on these things that likely have nothing to do with whether this act actually occurred or not. So it really, places the elders in a position where, again, if they look at these things and they decide that, I don't think the person was raped because they took too long, that person can just be found guilty of having committed sexual immorality and thereby be cut off from their family, which would mean they were cut off from their family because they were raped. It's just, this gets really complicated and really ugly really fast.
It's very problematic, ill thought out wording.
For sure.
This is an interesting part, which I know you've looked at in the past, Cliff. This whole loophole. Well, I wouldn't even call it a loophole. It's more of a reason to catch people. Strong circumstantial evidence of sexual immorality. What this whole section is saying is that there are exceptions to the two-witness rule, but not as respects child sex abuse, only as regards determining whether there has been adultery. Again, there's a whole other level of obsession attached to whether there's adultery as opposed to whether another type of sin has been committed. Consider an example in which judicial action would be warranted. A married brother spends an inordinate amount of time with his female secretary after work hours, but insists there is no romantic interest. His concerned wife informs the elders, who give him strong counsel. Later, when he claims to be leaving overnight for a business trip, his suspicious wife and a relative follow him to the secretary's home. And then it goes on to give a scenario where the secretary invites him in, and they are in the same building all night. And in those instances, someone would be disfellowshipped for adultery because there's circumstantial evidence of adultery. Again, this is a rule that is not applied to child sex abuse. But apart from that double standard, you also have the hypocrisy that a certain watchtower leader would fare very badly under this provision if his personal life were scrutinized. Because as I've covered in previous videos about Joseph Rutherford, he had someone follow him around everywhere, Berta Peel, who actually left her husband to be Rutherford's assistant. And she was supposed to be, I think, his physician, even though she had no formal medical training. She'd left her husband to be by his side constantly, went round the world with him, was staying, goodness knows what the arrangements were for accommodation. But Rutherford was married, and he lived apart from his estranged wife and son, and his estranged wife and son didn't even come to his funeral. And yet it's like, it's interesting to see the way there's this much focus on adultery in the 21st century, when one of the organization's own founders, who very much manufactured the organization into the form it is today, lived almost under an entirely different set of rules.
I think that's very true. Yeah. And, you know, another thing that I was thinking about as I was looking at these very specific examples, I don't know if you were going to cover, you know, they're talking about somebody's like over at a gathering and the last train leaves and all this kind of stuff. And you're thinking, wow, a lot of this stuff has probably actually happened. And, you know, they had to sit here and come up with a solution for these things. Whereas, you know, they could have just left these things alone and, you know, not tried to separate people's family based on all of these nuances. But, you know, this kind of gives you a glimpse into the type of matters that they have taken on in the past and tried to adjudicate.
So here we have another part of the book that's touching on domestic violence, adulterous marriage. This is basically the clause right here that I've highlighted, under which a domestic violence victim would be disfellowshipped if she legally divorced her husband and got remarried to someone else without there being adultery.
Right. Exactly. And adultery and rejection, which is something I'm pretty sure we're going to cover, you know, a little bit later. But as you kind of are pointing out, it doesn't allow for any other very extenuating circumstances why someone may want a divorce and then, you know, later find someone who is not abusive towards them or something of that nature. It has to be, you know, there's this very specific criteria that has to be met in order for the elders to basically okay the divorce and then the subsequent remarriage.
It's just fascinating how arbitrary some of this is. You have there some wording that says momentary touching of intimate body parts or caressing of breasts if such conduct occurred on a few isolated occasions, especially between two persons involved in a courtship with the intent to marry, counsel from two elders may suffice to handle such minor uncleanness. There's kind of these arbitrary determinations that if it's just a few isolated occasions, or if it only happened once or twice, as long as it's not happened for years, basically, there are loopholes, you know?
Right.
And witnesses aren't bothered about these loopholes.
And that's what's kind of interesting. That last statement you made, that witnesses aren't aware of these loopholes. The people that would be aware are people who become elders, right? Who are under these same rules. The only difference is, let's say there's an elder he's dating somebody and he's known that this has happened with him and, you know, his significant other or whatever. His thought process is going to be different than somebody who doesn't know these rules, who just thinks maybe they did this one time and thinks it's the end of the world and they're you know, a candidate for disfellowshipping. Well, he's going to know, okay, well, I probably should have did that, but I know that if I were to go talk to somebody, this is as far as it goes, right? And so that's where the discrepancy and the problem really, I think, comes in, you know,
the lack of transparency.
Exactly. And there's only a select few. If you think about the percentage of people in a congregation who are elders, it's such a small percentage. You know, how is that fair, for lack of a better term? You know, we can kind of see how those discrepancies could come in.
Now, this is interesting here. Viewing abhorrent forms of pornography. I was interested in this word, abhorrent. So you're telling me there's non-abhorrent forms of pornography? And what's interesting is that is exactly the case. So probably you'll be able to guess what it means by abhorrent versus non-abhorrent. And if we have time, we'll go into that in the next chapter, which is specifically dealing with pornography. It will become more clear what that distinction is. But again, you have this loophole where if it's non-abhorrent, and it doesn't use that phrase, by the way, or does it? If it's non-abhorrent, there's more latitude given.
Right.
But again, you don't know this as a witness, and you're going to be riddled with guilt if you don't know, which you won't.
Right. Exactly. So with the pornography, again, it's the kind of pornography, the content of what you're watching, and then the frequency. Let's say if it's a lower level pornography, according to their guidelines, if you've done that over a period of time or more than a few times, whatever that means, then you come into this other category, right?
I'm going to start Googling lower level pornography. What comes up?
Right. Exactly. I don't think it's a thing. That's my bet.
One or two elders may handle matters by means of counsel if a Christian abused an addictive drug or smoked cigarettes on one or two occasions and the matter is not widely known. Okay, two things here. First of all, it's saying you can smoke cigarettes on one or two occasions, no big deal. And secondly, where it says the matter is not widely known, I was pulling my hair out at the number of obvious examples in this book of gossip culture. So in other words, are witnesses gossiping about this or not? If no one's gossiping about it, what does the congregation think? As though the congregation's going to be polled on these issues. This is a loophole that a witness who tries a cigarette or smokes some pot will not know about.
Absolutely. And you know, I don't debate God or the Bible or things of that nature, but let's just say, just for the sake of this argument, if you think this is something that is ordained by God, would God care about something like that? Right? Whether it was like, it's in my mind, it's either wrong or it's right. Right? Let's just say, for the sake of argument, do you think that that's something that would be, you know, of divine origin, that, well, there was a couple of people that saw it, so now it's the disfellowshipable, you know, offense. So you can just kind of start to see how arbitrary some of these lines are.
there's an interesting U-turn going on here in the highlighted text, which begs the question, what about all the people in previous decades who've been disfellowshipped for taking medical marijuana, for having marijuana or products based on marijuana prescribed to them by a medical professional? And here we are in 2019. I actually tried looking for this. I think it's in there is actually a provision similar to it in the 2010 Elders Guidebook, but there's no such provision in the older 1991 Pay Attention book. So it's very much a case, Cliff, of when do you happen to be alive as a Jehovah's Witness?
Very true. Yeah. As it is with other things, I remember there have been people on my channel that I've interviewed that have talked about, people getting in trouble for organ transplants, for receiving organ transplants and being disfellowshipped, right? And then, because there was at one point they said that was cannibalism, and then they said, well, New Light is not cannibalism. Those people are already disfellowshipped or maybe dead in some extreme cases for obeying, the guidelines on that. So, right. It begs the question, is there any responsibility taken? We know the answer is no, but is there any responsibility taken for, giving these guidelines and telling people that, their salvation depends on these things? It's just very irresponsible on many levels.
I want you to focus here on how Watchtower is using words. It's giving us alternative definitions for what brazen conduct is, including licentiousness, filthiness, lasciviousness, wantonness, unbridled lust, outrageousness, shamelessness, insolence, violates all bounds of what is socially acceptable. And look at what the first example of this is. I mean, really, that's supposed to be violating all bounds of what is socially acceptable.
Right.
That's supposed to be outrageous and shameless, unnecessary association with disfellowshipped or disassociated individuals.
Right.
Absolutely astonishing.
I hadn't even made that connection, the way that you just laid it out, but it's like, of course, something completely just out of bounds. Like, let's say talking to somebody that's not in your religion anymore, for example, right? We all agree that that's just completely outrageous. And the other thing that I was thinking is, as they're giving these definitions and wantonness and all of these things, these are pretty subjective words, right? Like this is not something that everybody is going to agree on. So they can use these definitions all they want, but at the end of the day, they're defining what these words even mean. The words they're using to define brazen conduct, they're defining it, in their own way. And it's not a way that anybody would really come up with on their own.
Here you have two fairly short paragraphs on drunkenness, which again boils down to gossip culture. Who knows about it? Is there notoriety? If there's no notoriety, all depends on who's talking about it. Gluttony, one paragraph. This is another one where you have a clear rule in the Bible. There's nothing about pornography in the Bible, and believe me, they had porn in ancient times. But you don't have a single provision about pornography. In the Shepherd book, there's a whole chapter on it. You do, however, have provisions on gluttony in the Bible, and you just get that. And then you have
nuances, whether it's drunkenness or gluttony, or we're going to talk about stealing even a little bit later. If you look at the scriptures, the Bible just lists these things along with what they, sexual immorality or fornication or adultery. It doesn't say this if it's a whole bunch of times and or a lot of people know about it, right? But for some, in these same lists where all of this stuff appears, there's certain things that have been plucked out and have said, yeah, but this is actually over here. and this has to be, this certain amount of times. So where does that come from? You might ask.
It's completely arbitrary. Look at there in the gluttony paragraph. It says gluttony is determined not by someone's size, but by his attitude toward food. Fred, how do you feel about food? Well, I can take it or leave it. It's just how do you find out what someone's attitude is?
Right?
It's just outrageous. And seriously, Cliff, I was really annoyed about this actually. Stealing. We're talking about an actual crime, an actual, I've just stolen your laptop, Cliff.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Lloyd, though all stealing is wrong, the body of elders should use discernment in weighing the circumstances and the extent of the involvement in wrongdoing to determine whether it is a judicial matter. That's it. Mm-hmm. That is it. I've literally stolen something, and it's, well, what were the circumstances?
Right. Exactly. We don't want to go overboard. Let's be reasonable on this stuff here.
I just honestly, I mean, you're again talking about, isn't stealing in the Ten Commandments as well? You're talking about something that is literally a thing in the Bible and in law, and they've summoned I'm going to say a sentence on it.
Yeah.
While sex gets multiple, well, it gets pornography, as I said before, gets a chapter.
Yeah.
This is just absolutely outrageous.
Sure.
I'm going to move on before I have an aneurysm.
Yeah.
Now, here's an interesting one. I was talking to Deanna about this earlier. This is a proper rule change here.
Yeah.
So greed, gambling, extortion. Viewers, I don't know how many of the 414 that are now watching are actually Jehovah's Witnesses, either physically and mentally out, or you're just kind of watching because you're curious. But ordinary Jehovah's Witnesses have not been told that you are now allowed to gamble so long as it is, quote unquote, petty gambling. So let me highlight some text here. Elders do not generally involve themselves in what an individual does with regard to petty gambling solely for entertainment. However, if such petty gambling affects his spirituality or becomes a cause of stumbling for others, counsel should be given. As long as it's petty gambling and as long as it's solely for entertainment, have at it. But if you look at the KS10, the previous Shepherd book, this is literally what it said about gambling. I'm going to quote word for word, and if you don't believe me, go and download the book. It said, Christians should avoid gambling in all its various forms, including lotteries.
Yeah, that's what we were always told.
It's a rule change, which is fine. Well, I say fine fairly cautiously because what the hell was going on when this was written? Mm-hmm. But what concerns me, Cliff, is first of all the people who were disfellowshipped for petty gambling, and second of all, why aren't witnesses being told about this?
Right. Lloyd, do you mind if just before we move on from the gambling, I don't want to spend a whole lot more time on it, but just in paragraph 32, very briefly, because this is another one of those head scratchers.
Yeah.
It says that, I'll read it from what you have here. It says an individual continuing in employment directly involved in gambling or employment making him a clear accomplice or promoter of gambling would be subject to judicial action after being given about 6 months to make the needed adjustments. I want to point out that it doesn't say an individual involved in something more than petty gambling, right? So what I understand this to mean is you can be a petty gambler, but you cannot be the person facilitating the petty gambling, because then you're up for judicial action. But if you're just a consumer, not only are you not up for judicial action, you may know the elders won't even generally involve themselves with that. It's just, again, where does this come from? And who is aware of these rules? Go ahead.
if your congregation elders find out that you're working the blackjack table, you will get 6 months, which again to find a new job. And if you don't get a new job after that 6 months, then you'll be disfellowshipped. But again, why 6 months? Where in the Bible does it say 6 months?
Right.
It's a very, very arbitrary period. And quite frankly, a lot of gambling can be done in 6 months. So
yeah, you can change your life for the better or for the worse.
It really is an astonishing book.
Yeah.
Adamant refusal to provide materially for one's own family, leaving wife and children destitute when having the means to provide may warrant judicial action. My question is, what about refusal to provide emotionally for the family, as in cases where parents are told to shun their children? Why is it just about money?
Absolutely.
A Christian who cannot control his anger cannot be viewed as exemplary in the congregation. After his attitude, the pattern of behavior and the severity of damage to the lives of others have been considered. A person who gives in to uncontrolled fits of anger may need to be dealt with judicially. In questionable cases, consult the service department. Absent from this paragraph, Cliff, is any mention of the need to protect abused spouses.
Right. And even the term domestic violence is only in the subheading. It's not even in the paragraph. It's just talking about general violence, like equating all of these things as if they're all the same. So yeah, that's definitely something that's irresponsible on their part not to include that.
You also, talking on the subject of petty, if a Christian took up professional boxing and refused to stop despite repeated counsel, I'm imagining elders at the ringside,
Don't hit them.
oh, good grief. Judicial action would be appropriate. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
And then further on it says, the committee should base its decision on clearly established facts, not simply on a decision that may have been made by the secular authorities. We know better than the cops. Elders can know better than law enforcement when it comes to finding out whether there's been manslaughter. Madness.
I know. It seems like it's getting progressively worse.
As is my mental health as I'm reading this. Apostasy is a standing away from true worship, a falling away, defection, rebellion, abandonment. It includes the following. Oh, this is interesting. Who'd have thought, Cliff, that celebrating a false religious holiday, Christmas, is an act of apostasy requiring judicial action? Correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't Jeffrey Jackson say that you could celebrate Christmas and not be disfellowshipped?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure he said that in case study 29 of the Australian Royal Commission.
Indeed. And he had a copy of this was the book that he had at that time, because this is obviously the update, but it has the exact same provision in the 2010 Shepherd book. Jeffrey Jackson is a governing body member, but he is also an elder, and all elders have to have a copy of this. And he knew what was in it, or at least he should have known what was in it, because he helped write it. And he just straight up lied to the Australian Royal Commission. But of course, we've already learned that lying under points 22 and 23, well, let's just see what the circumstances are, shall we?
Right.
Deliberately spreading teachings contrary to Bible truth. Of course, we all know who gets to decide what Bible truth is. This is interesting. A guilty plea entered in court by a Christian as part of a plea bargain, perhaps on the advice of an attorney so as to avoid the possibility of a harsher sentence, would generally not in itself be viewed by the congregation as an admission of guilt.
Right.
You can stand before a court of law and plead guilty, but that won't be necessarily considered as a confession of guilt. Isn't that interesting?
Right.
I wonder why that would be.
Yeah, I know. I can
Madness.
think of certain sins or crimes that would probably cover.
Yeah, especially crimes that might, I don't know, cause Jehovah's name to be besmirched in some way. The testimony of youths may be considered. It is up to the elders to determine whether the testimony has the ring of truth.
Right.
The testimony of unbelievers and disfellowshipped or disassociated ones may also be considered, but it must be weighed carefully. In other words, if it's a child, if it's a disfellowshipped or disassociated one, so honestly, it's so biased in favor of people who are walking the line as Jehovah's Witnesses.
And who are adults.
Yes,
also.
Indeed.
And especially if you consider that in light of what is the biggest black eye, arguably, on Jehovah's Witnesses right now, which is the issue with how they deal with child abuse. Honestly, you're kind of surprised this is in here, worded this way, especially them knowing, how people have access to this, because this is something that Angus Stewart keyed in on. I forget if he was talking to Spinks or if he was talking to Jeffrey Jackson. You probably know better than me, but during the Royal Commission, this is the point that he made. Isn't this saying that you're to, basically tend to disbelieve more times than not, especially young people, and so it really sets the stage for all of these horrible things that we've already, seen in great detail.
Oh, here we are, page 72 in the original book. It said, if the accuser or the accused is unwilling to meet with the elders, or if the accused continues to deny the accusation of a single witness and the wrongdoing is not established, the elders will leave matters in Jehovah's hands. And here they've changed it to the matter cannot be handled judicially, which I'm pretty sure, Cliff, that's just a case of avoiding embarrassment.
Yeah, it means the same thing, It essentially means the same thing, I think. But yeah, I think that wording, I can imagine the organization trying to distance itself from that specific wording because it's caused a lot of embarrassment.
You have a section here, those who have not associated for many years. These are the abeyance provisions, which are extended to faders, where it says, look, if you're faded and you've not been to a meeting in years, we're not going to hunt you down as enthusiastically as we might do if you're going to the meeting week in, week out.
Right.
Number one, I've interviewed multiple people on this channel in my Fade Interrupted series where that's not happened and where quite extraordinary lengths have been gone to hunt people down in that exact situation. And number two, even though they have this provision, first of all, let's just read this part here. Depending upon the length of inactivity and other factors noted above, the elders may determine to hold the matter in abeyance. But when you look at the next paragraph here, and I know this will be relevant to lots of people who are watching who are perhaps weighing that maybe they're faders themselves, or they're weighing whether to fade versus whether to disassociate. It says, if the sinful conduct, if they're involved in sinful conduct and it's known only to believing family members and no congregation action has been taken, believing relatives will likely determine to curtail family association severely, viewing the relative as bad association. It's saying here, look, you're still going to get shunned if you're doing anything that we disapprove of.
Right. And because this information is for the elders, who is it that is going to tell those believing, those witness relatives that the best course of action would be to curtail or cut that communication off? Obviously, it would be the elders. So it's still something that is going to be viewed as being sanctioned, from those at the top of the congregation. If you don't mind, is it possible I could just highlight one part in paragraph 44, number 5? This is something I've posted about on my social media.
Sure.
That I think is kind of, just very dishonest way of conducting business, if you will. It
Yeah.
says, is the person willing to meet with the committee, thus admitting accountability to the Christian congregation? So the way that I read that is, all right, brother such and such, we would like to invite you. Would you be willing to, come and meet with the committee? The person says yes. And it's like, that's it right there. See, he admits that he's accountable to the organization. And at that point, they have the green light to be able to take action, against them. Whereas if the person were not to accept or, indicate in some way that they don't have accountability, then, they may not be able to proceed. I know that's not how it happens every time, but I think it's something that people need to be aware of, especially if they're trying to fade, that you have to be very careful how you answer questions and how you answer invitations. Because you don't want to pick any of these
rules
boxes.
aren't made clear to you.
Right.
No one's kind of going to tell you, oh, by the way, we operate on a hear no evil, see no evil,
right.
Don't ask, don't tell policy, whereby if you make any noises that you still consider yourself a witness, we've got you.
Exactly.
And speaking of don't ask, don't tell, let's go to 57. I'm skimming through quite a bit at this point because I'm mindful of the fact that we've probably bitten off more than we can chew. So I'm getting to the juicy bits.
Right.
This is a provision. I'm sorry, Cliff. You just are not told about this.
I know.
As a Jehovah's Witness. What this provision is saying, well, I'll read it. Depending upon the circumstances, serious wrongdoing that's occurred years in the past may need to be handled by a judicial committee. However, if wrongdoing occurred more than a few years ago and the individual is genuinely repentant and recognizes that he should have come forward immediately when he sinned, counsel by 2 elders may be sufficient. It's best to keep quiet, but again, you're not told that.
Exactly. In fact, you're told the exact opposite. You're given the indication that every day that you go forward pretending to be a law-abiding Jehovah's Witness, having this sin on your conscience, you're like grieving Jehovah's Holy Spirit, and you're making a mockery of his, arrangement and everything. Whereas, going back to the point I had before, the elders are also under these same rules. The difference is they'll know, right, if something happens, or if I did something when I was a teenager or whatever, and I haven't come forward and I'm an elder now that I see the book, oh, okay, well, I'll just let 10 more years go by and I'll tell a brother like, hey, I did something back in, whatever time, but I knew I should have came forward. They know the rules, so they're not dealt with the same way. Whereas somebody who's a rank and file, or even a ministerial servant, because they don't have access to this book, they're going to be, like being tortured for years and years and years, thinking I'm just a dishonest Jehovah's Witness and I'm getting killed at Armageddon because they don't have access to this book.
Point 67. I love this. Permitting individuals to commit sexual immorality in the home. If a publisher were to allow an individual to commit sexual immorality, Lloyd, please may I commit sexual immorality in your home? Sure, you just go ahead. No, seriously, how is it? What scenario are they thinking of here? If a publisher were to allow an individual to commit sexual immorality while living in the publisher's home, he would be giving tacit approval to immoral conduct. This would also be true of allowing an individual to commit sexual immorality while visiting the publisher's home. Such a publisher would not be exemplary. You can get into trouble if you don't stop people from having sex.
Right. And remember, sexual immorality covers a huge range of things. So, the example I thought it's silly, first of all, but the example that I thought of is like, let's say you have family members come over and it's a couple and they're not married technically, and they're just going to come, probably they're not witnesses, and they're going to come and just stay over and they sleep in the same room or something. Like, is it your job at that point to be like, well, I don't want to lose my privileges, so I'm going to need you guys to sleep in different homes or in different rooms or something?
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's like you have some guests around who aren't married, and they wake up in the middle of the night, and there you are in the corner of the room watching. Are you having sex yet? It's just absolutely astonishing.
Yeah.
That they're basically demanding that witnesses police each other at this point, though verbally expressing forgiveness and not seeking a divorce. The innocent mate refuses to resume sexual relations for a very prolonged period of time, a year or even years. So this is the level to which elders are required to pry into matters of a sexual nature.
Right.
They get to ask, have you had sex? Of someone in this situation, to find out whether there's been rejection or not. It really is astonishing.
And I was going to say, I try not to do too many, excuse me, anecdotes, unless they're like directly supported by what I'm reading here. And I know the situation is actually a friend of mine at the time when I was a witness. Excuse me, got a little tickle in my throat here. That basically, their spouse had committed adultery, and then had come back and I guess confessed to my friend, and they resumed their sexual relationship. But after a while, my friend decided, you know what, I just can't get over it. I can't get over what that person had done. Well, your path, so to speak, to divorce that person is gone now, because you've resumed these sexual relationships, even if you've realized that you shouldn't have, so to speak. You've now negated that. So if you were to at that point get a divorce and then get remarried, you're subject to being disfellowshipped.
Marking, I've spoken quite a bit about marking on the channel. Marking is like soft shunning. It's to cover a whole bunch of stuff that isn't necessarily a judicial issue, but it's considered as walking disorderly. Here's some examples here. Grossly lazy. Lloyd, you're being grossly lazy. Or critical, or being a profitless talker. Lloyd, quit with the profitless talking. That's something I'm guilty of on this channel, many would argue. Who is a constant meddler with what does not concern him. So that's the sort of stuff that can get you marked. And rather than being full-on shunning, as is the case with disfellowshipping, it's a matter of the congregation not being allowed to socialize with you outside of the Kingdom Hall and ministry arrangements, and it can be brought to a swift end if the elders are seen to be socializing with you again. So that's marking. Here's an interesting one right at the end, and I'm glad that we finally reached chapter 12, the end of chapter 12, after 90 minutes, no less. Attempted suicide. A suicide attempt may be the result of deep despair or major depression. Elders should deal carefully and compassionately with such a person. In most cases, a judicial hearing is not required. So in some cases, it will be required.
It's definitely leaving the door open for that. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that one of our fellow XJWs that was on the Leah Remini show with us said that was part of the reason for his disfellowshipping, if you recall, was for a suicide attempt. So that's, it's definitely something that they're able to do if they feel like it's appropriate.
I'm putting the banner there so that when I'm skimming through in the future, I know where to put my time stamps.
Sure.
Which is on the subject of pornography. Again, astonishing that you have an entire chapter devoted to pornography and literally a sentence on actually stealing things. But you may remember earlier, I picked up on the fact that there's a difference between abhorrent and non-abhorrent pornography. And I left the question dangling. What do you think might be the difference? And I'm sure some of you have already figured it out, but let's go through it anyway. It tells us here what abhorrent pornography is. Abhorrent forms of pornography include homosexuality, sex between those of the same gender, group sex, bestiality. This video is totally getting demonetized if it hasn't already been. Sadistic torture. Commiserations there from Cliff. Sadistic torture, bondage, gang rape, oh dear, the brutalizing of women, or child pornography. It is equally wrong for a man or a woman to watch two women engaged in homosexual activity as it is for a man or woman to watch two men engaged in homosexual activity. Basically, Cliff, it's abhorrent if it's not straight sex.
Right.
And again, I'm not going to go into the ins and outs, if you'll excuse the pun, but it is interesting how the homophobia of the organization extends into the way the organization thinks about pornography, and it certainly thinks about it an awful lot if you've seen Pillowgate. So let's
definitely
let paragraph 1. It says elders should adhere closely to the direction in this chapter when a matter involving child abuse comes to their attention. Doing so will uphold the sanctity of Jehovah's name. Interesting that that's first. And contribute toward the safety of minors. Do you think that this material contributes to the safety of minors, Mark?
No, I really don't, because the bottom line is that you were asking that clergy or anyone who's a mandated reporter report allegations of abuse to the authorities, and to allow victims to have the opportunity to be interviewed by trained professionals, including law enforcement as well as professional therapists. So it is not only dangerous to the victims themselves, but it's dangerous to future victims or people that are not protected, including non-Jehovah's Witness children who are not protected because of Watchtower's policies. And the reality of the matter is they simply don't care about non-Jehovah's Witness children. In fact, their representative, Thomas Jefferson Jr., who is a branch member who testified at the Fessler trial in 2017, was questioned on the witness stand as to whether or not elders have an obligation to protect non-witness children. And he answered it very directly and said, no, there is no obligation.
You have this cookie cutter language that we're so used to now. It's just sickening when you hear it. First of all, it says from the Bible standpoint, child sex abuse is a gross sin. Well, this is the whole problem with the policy, the fact that it's a sin first and a crime only by coincidence, according to Watchtower. And then you have this Jehovah's Witnesses abhor child sexual abuse. Of course you do. Well, actually, no one's disputing the fact that theologically you do abhor child abuse. It's just that you wouldn't know that when you examine some of the policies that actually facilitate it.
There's no question, Lloyd, and it really is just an empty statement to say Jehovah's Witnesses abhor child abuse. We know that all those people in Arkansas that were members of the congregation whose children were abused over a 17-year period, or some portion of that period, of course they abhorred child abuse. The children abhor it. The parents abhor it. Of course they do. This is not, that's a deflection. That is a deflection from the real issue, which is how to handle allegations of child sexual abuse, what to do with them, how to let the professionals handle it, and even how to handle it internally. So all of that is where the corruption, the cover-up, and the problem exists, much like it did within the Catholic Church.
I think anyone who's familiar, Mark, with the JW versus Watchtower case and the fact that Watchtower unsuccessfully petitioned the Supreme Court of the United States of America for its right as a religion to literally shield perpetrators of this abomination by keeping secret records that aren't available to the authorities. Anyone who knows about that can only view this as an extremely disingenuous thing to say. It says, therefore, the victim, her parents, or anyone else who reports such an allegation to the elders should be clearly informed that they have the right to report the matter to the secular authorities. Elders do not criticize anyone who chooses to make such a report. And Mark, I'm just reading from my notes that I had to transfer.
Right.
It always reminds me when it says you have the right, and then I juxtapose it against what Stephen Lett said in a talk at the convention, where he said, just because you have the right to do something doesn't mean you should do that thing. All things are lawful, not all things are advantageous. So just because you're entitled to do something doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. That's the kind of element of witness culture that this policy completely overlooks. And also there's a difference between not dissuading and actively encouraging. So if elders are really taking seriously the need to protect their congregation from further victims being accrued or accumulated, they should be encouraging or telling the victim or the family to go to the police, not merely saying, well, it's your decision.
Yeah, I've written about that term absolute right a number of times, including in several JW survey articles. That is a term that came up in Australia. It came up in multiple other civil cases here in the United States, where they use this clever language of absolute right to say that, look, we're not preventing parents from going to the police. They have the absolute right. But that in no way says they are advised. Nowhere in this book, nowhere in any Watchtower article, including the one that we've discussed from May of this year, nowhere does it ever say that elders should or parents should immediately contact the law enforcement when their child is abused or when their child says they're abused, or some other form of the allegation.
Child abuse is a crime. In some jurisdictions, individuals who learn of an allegation of child abuse, actually, Mark, you know what? The whole chapter, if you think about it, could just be those 5 words. Child abuse is a crime. If you actually take those words
Correct.
seriously, you don't actually need a chapter at all, do you?
Look, let's just call it child abuse is a crime. What do we do with crimes? We let law enforcement handle that. End of story. Chapter, rip it out, leave those words in. We're done. And how would that harm the religion, Lloyd? I mean, come on. How would that? They can believe in paradise earth, the resurrection. They can talk about paradise. They can present their carts. Look, this is a crime. And even though they cleverly now admit that it's a crime, they're not treating it like a real crime. So I agree completely. Let's just let the law enforcement handle it. They're only damaging their own organization and the people who donate to it. I mean, we just discussed the JW versus Watchtower case. That's one case where they've now got to pay close to $6 million, a $4 million judgment plus accrued interest to just one victim in that case. And that's almost $6 million of donated money, ice cream money from children who are putting their dollars in the contribution box, supporting an organization that is not protecting them.
I'm going to read on with the paragraph, but I'm going to subtly alter the words. In some jurisdictions, individuals who learn of an allegation of murder may be obligated by law to report the allegation to the secular authorities. I mean, again, if it's a crime, why are you interested in what your responsibilities are on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis? If it's a crime, you report it, regardless of whether the law insists that you report it. And you have here, just finally in this section, a paragraph on child pornography and sexting. I just want to highlight some of the wording here. If the elders become aware of an adult associated with a congregation who has been involved with child pornography, 2 elders should immediately call the legal department. And it also says, likewise, if the elders become aware of an adult or minor associated with a congregation who is sexting with a minor, the legal department should be called immediately. So they're saying here, don't go to the police if you find out that someone's involved in child porn. Don't go to the police if you find out that someone is sexting a minor. Let me contrast this material, and indeed the other material that we've been discussing, which is very vague on the need to involve the authorities at all, and jump to another chapter entirely. This is actually, I believe, chapter 20 on disruptive individuals. This is the procedure for if someone gets into a meeting and starts to cause a disturbance. Look what the direction is. The police will be contacted.
Yeah. Look, what can we say, Lloyd? They'll call the police
if the individual is violent from the outset, the police can be called immediately. Well, where are Watchtower's priorities, Mark? If they can't call the police immediately if they find out someone's sexting children, they can't call the police immediately if they find out someone's involved in child porn, they can't call the police immediately if they find out a child's been raped, but hey, someone's disrupting the meeting, call the cops. And it says, when discussing child sexual abuse from a congregation standpoint, we would, this is what we were talking about. We are not considering a situation in which a minor who is a willing participant and who is approaching adulthood is involved in sexual activity with an adult who is a few years older than the minor. It's almost as though, Mark, they don't understand what a minor is according to the law. A minor under the law cannot be a willing participant.
Correct. So, I want to make it clear that the organization is lying when they say that a child or a minor would not be disciplined by the organization as a victim, and that is absolutely false. And we have many cases to back this up, and including going back to my own childhood. My first experience with a disfellowshipped person in this same congregation was a young girl who, had been sexually molested by this man who was 3 or 4 times her age, and they disfellowshipped the girl. She was around 15 years of age, no more than 16 at the most, and they disfellowshipped her. Now, same thing happened in Delaware. I think most people that watch our channel or read JW Survey are familiar with Delaware, state of Delaware versus the Laurel Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses. It was a 14-year-old baptized boy who was disfellowshipped after having sex more than 50 times with a woman who was more than twice his age. It was like an assistant school teacher. They were both baptized witnesses. The elders found out. Police were never called. It was actually the mother who ultimately called the police. But again, this is a situation where a 14-year-old boy was disfellowshipped for being a willing participant. So they held him accountable for his sexual behavior rather than just letting the police handle it and letting him get the kind of therapy that this young person needed. So they believe that at a very, very young age, a child is what they call a mature minor, also a willing participant, but a mature minor. And this has to do with the blood policy as well, because they believe that a young person has a right to, especially if they're baptized, make a decision as a mature minor on refusing blood.
Elders should demonstrate empathy and compassion when anyone approaches them about a matter involving child abuse. Ongoing spiritual shepherding is especially important for victims of child sexual abuse and their families. So what they're saying, someone is abused, someone suffers child sexual abuse. What's especially important is that they receive shepherding from the elders. That's the priority here. Would you agree with that, Mark?
And yes, and it
You
right.
would agree with it.
Facetious, yeah, facetiously.
Yeah.
So it is the worst possible thing that they can do. And look, when I came into this, I didn't know a lot several years ago when I knew about these emerging cases of child sexual abuse and how they hadn't been reported. But what I didn't know was just how bad it was when the elders spent so much time with child sexual abuse victims, either interviewing them or shepherding them. And one of the things I've learned from detectives and investigators, including the investigator in the Arkansas case who spent several hundred hours putting an elder behind prison for the rest of his life for what he did, was she told me that the elders obstructed her investigation so badly because they had interviewed these children. And by the way, there were at least 10 interviewed by the police. When they finally got to these children and interviewed them, a lot of these children had already been interviewed by the elders multiple times. And what she said to me is that is the complete polar opposite of their training. Their training is to interview victims of child abuse as little as possible, the fewest number of times. And there's a whole host of reasons why they do that. One of the things she did tell me was that, the memories of these children do develop over a period of time, meaning there's a trust factor. Okay, so already the children don't trust because they've been sexually molested by a perpetrator, and in this case, an elder. So they already have a trust problem. So when they finally get to talk to the police know for a fact that the child is not going to reveal everything all at once. It's going to come in stages as they build trust with that child. And to build trust with that child, they have to go through an extensive procedure. They have all sorts of methods of helping a child without frightening or endangering that child, things that the elders have absolutely no idea how to do. When I was walking into the courthouse one day, there was a therapy dog there that had come from one of the centers where children are interviewed. They use dogs. They take the children to a special place that is not a cold police station. It is a special building. It is all child friendly. It is designed with years and years of research using animals, using visual aids. I mean, it is so much work that is put into how to properly interview a child. And the elders destroy all of that. They wreck it because they interview these children on multiple occasions and they get them to tell what they did, whether or not they were complicit in the sexual act, whether they had their clothes on or not, whether they orgasmed or not, all of these things. It just re-traumatizes the child like you wouldn't believe. And it ends up causing them not to trust other adults, including law enforcement. So by the time the police finally get to interview these children, I mean, they're a wreck.
There's some incredible wording here in point 15. And if I've skipped any points for the sake of time, Mark, feel free to drag me back. But this really stood out for me. Though it may be necessary for the elders to ask a few tactful questions to help an afflicted one express herself, they should avoid probing unnecessarily or repeatedly into the details of the abuse. However, discussing biblical examples of others who endured a difficult childhood and yet succeeded in becoming faithful servants of Jehovah may provide needed comfort. In time, Jehovah God will heal the brokenhearted. Surely this is proof, Mark, that they simply do not understand how devastating child sex abuse is if the solution is for the abuse victim to compare their experience with a Bible character who's had a difficult childhood. Apparently, someone who endures this trauma, they're having a difficult childhood.
It talks about if an elder is asked for advice on this matter, he may direct attention to appropriate Bible principles and material in our publications. And then it gives a reference to which Watchtower articles. There's one from 2015. There's one from 2008. So, for example, the one from 2008 says, in view of the foregoing, if we have doubts about some diagnostic or therapeutic procedure, we would be wise to reject it. So I just want people to understand, it's Watchtower is saying, if we have some doubts about a therapeutic procedure or diagnostic procedure, meaning a professional therapist, for example, we would be wise to reject it. And even though they say it's a personal or conscience matter, the fact of the matter is that everything about Watchtower's teachings is, look, we are inside this bubble. We're not part of the world. So be careful. Don't go out there.
Why would you want to go to worldly wisdom
right.
to navigate your way through this?
Right. So we're not dealing with, you know, growing up, including myself and you growing up, we didn't have a full set of cards that we could really play, because we were told that outside worldly wisdom was false. And it creates this doubt about professional therapists, about police officers. It creates a mistrust of the world from the very people who really are trying to help these children and protect them.
Careful. This is what talking about the kind of the mindset or the approach when it comes to investigating allegations of abuse. It says elders should carefully follow scriptural procedures and the Bible-based direction in this chapter and in chapter 12. And I think what we can both agree on, Mark, is that when it says scriptural procedures, what they mean is the two-witness rule.
Yeah, and boy, they just won't let go of that two-witness rule, will they?
I think that the Shepherd book is almost inevitable for an organization that claims or desires the power and control that Watchtower insists on. Because you can't, how can you micromanage how tight someone's pants are and not micromanage what they're doing in their sex lives or other areas of their life? Once you get to a certain point of wishing to insert yourself in people's lives, it's almost inevitable that you're going to end up with a rule book that's over 200 pages long. How can you not? Because that's the level of control that you're after. But I am hoping that by having this discussion and the discussion with Cliff and the discussion that I will be having with Sherry, my plan is that, number one, we can give some pushback to this nonsense, but also just show it, because, you know, how many witnesses even know that this book exists, or even that there's a possibility for them to see what's in it? So just by having these videos online, I'm hoping that we'll at least, you know, get the discussion moving a little bit. Judicial Committee, section 19. Here you have again this code word for the two-witness rule. If the body of elders concludes that there is sufficient scriptural evidence. They could have just said, if the body of elders concludes that the two-witness rule is satisfied, but they know that, I think they know that, you know, outside bodies and courts and commissions are going to be poring over this, just as we're poring over it. You also have here this sentence: if wrongdoing is established and the wrongdoer is not repentant, he should be disfellowshipped. And in my notes I've put, if the two-witness rule is paramount, where are they getting their evidence from? Are child abusers being let off? Which goes back to what we were saying earlier, that they've kind of tied their hands in how they can even get evidence, how they can even establish the wrongdoing, so that probably child abusers aren't being disfellowshipped. It says, on the other hand, if the wrongdoer is repentant and is reproved, the reproof should be announced to the congregation at the next midweek meeting. This announcement will serve as a protection for the congregation. I think it was picked up, wasn't it, in the Australian Royal Commission. How on earth can it be a protection for the congregation if they're literally just announcing so-and-so has been reproved? How is that supposed to protect the congregation? And before you comment, please incorporate into your comment also what we were already talking about. Again, you have this concept of a minor who is a willing participant. Call the service department.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think
you have to laugh. You have to laugh so that you don't cry, I guess. It's just...
Yeah. Well, again, it kind of goes back to the that Arkansas case when I discovered that there were victims in Indiana. And by the way, that discovery on my end didn't happen until the JW Survey article, and then a whole bunch of people came forward, including family members of a victim who was brutally drugged and raped in Indiana, and when by the same pedophile. And when the elders in Arkansas finally were informed by a family member that this man committed this crime in Indiana, they wanted immediately to interview the victim because he was no longer a minor at that point. And they wanted to ask him all sorts of questions. And one of the questions that they tried to ask him immediately was, when this happened, were your clothes on or off?
Let's see. Someone accused of child sex abuse gets reinstated into the congregation. So they're back in circulation, so to speak. And it says, in such cases, direction from the service department to the elders will include restrictions imposed on the individual's activities within the congregation, on his participation in the field ministry, and on his interaction with minors. The elders will be directed to caution the individual never to be alone with a minor, not to cultivate friendships with minors, not to display affection for minors, and so forth. Mark, this amounts to elders assuming that they can stop a pedophile from preying on children, or indeed talk a pedophile into not being a pedophile. Again, I just don't think they understand how this works. No matter how much power and authority elders have, they simply are not physically in a position to be making sure these people don't prey on children.
Most of them have full-time jobs. We even read earlier that, or no, maybe we didn't get to this point yet, but the book mentions the fact that elders can't be there for everyone, meaning that their time is limited. So they can't have extended counseling sessions because the organization knows they have full-time jobs, most of them, and that they are doing all these other congregation responsibilities, taking the group out, studying, preparing talks, doing all of the things that are designed to keep Jehovah's Witnesses busy. So they can't possibly monitor individuals. The only thing they can do is make a false show of it by, look, I've had people come to me and say, oh yeah, we knew that this guy was a known child abuser in congregation XYZ. And so we kept an eye on him. In fact, we even followed him into the bathroom if he went into the bathroom. So that's convenient to them because it's during a congregation meeting when they're going to be there anyway. But that doesn't take into account the hundreds of hours this person, male or female, has access to other children. And on top of that, it doesn't protect persons who are not witnesses. And that is one of the most disturbing things. I mentioned it earlier. Organization honestly doesn't care about persons that are outside of the organization, even though they're preaching to them and trying to bring them in. But in the case of the elder that came to me, who was told to destroy notes, one of his biggest concerns was that because they didn't even handle this man judicially after his 3 children said he abused us, and this is a recent case, he said to me, well, this is disturbing because he's moved back into my state nearby and he lives right next door. He's obviously separated from his wife, but he lives right next door to a family that has a bunch of children. So you've got a known child molester that Watchtower knows, and they won't call the police. They waited until a parent called the police, but this guy's living right next door to family with children. They could have a cookout, come on over, kids, jump in the pool. Next thing you know, other non-witness children are abused by this person.
It says the service department will direct the elders to inform family heads of minors within the congregation of the need to monitor their children's interaction with the individual. The elders would take this step only if directed to do so by the service department. Well, first of all, and Mark, I think this was a change that was introduced, if memory serves, in the October 1st, 2012 letter, because I remember writing about it at the time. They made this concession and said, okay, well, maybe it is reasonable in some cases to notify family heads that there is a known predator in the congregation, but this isn't something where the elders get to take the initiative. This is something that the service department has to give them permission to do. So immediately we're not talking about in every instance this happening. We're only talking about if the service department deems it appropriate. And even then, Mark, Watchtower seems to think that they're keeping a lid on the issue if they're telling the family heads, here's a scenario. What if you're an elderly couple whose children have their own family
Visiting
in another congregation and they decide to visit you for the weekend? You're not technically a family head because your children are grown up and they're in another congregation and they decide to visit. How are you supposed to know?
There's too many loopholes.
So the wording here is one who has engaged in child sexual abuse does not qualify to receive any privileges in the congregation, not full stop, but for many years, if ever. For me, that just slightly leaves the door ajar a little bit too much. I think that they could have done with a full stop after congregation.
And they won't do that, Lloyd, because it's a religion of forgiveness, where anyone can have their sins forgiven and come back and work themselves back into a position of authority. We've seen that time and time and time again. That is part of the draw of the religion. And I know it sounds like, using that term pedophile paradise seems extreme, but the reality is when you evaluate the facts, it is one of the easier, most easy congregations or religions rather to have access to children and be able to commit these crimes with little protection for the congregation.
I alluded earlier to the fact that there's evidence actually in the Shepherd book concerning the child sex abuse database. If you know where to find it, this is where you find it. So, the question might be asked, how are elders supposed to deal with the information that they gather when they're carrying out all of these tasks, when they are investigating child sex abusers and so forth? Information concerning individuals associated with the congregation and accused of child sexual abuse, established or not, including letters of introduction, should be placed in an envelope labeled with the individual's name and marked "Do Not Destroy." This envelope should be kept in the congregation's confidential file. This would include notification of disfellowshipping or disassociation S77 forms on individuals who have committed child sexual abuse, even if later reinstated. If you understand the language and you can untangle it, what this is saying is essentially that there are two databases, if you think about it, because it's saying keep a database at the Kingdom Hall in the congregation's confidential file, and also make sure that you've got your S77 notification of disfellowshipping form filled out, which of course, if you flick onto other parts of the book, we know goes to Watchtower. So the evidence that they're gathering this information and storing it both at the Kingdom Hall and forwarding it onto Watchtower is actually right here in the book, if you know where to look.
So one thing I can share with everyone, and I think a few people have seen this before, is what the elders actually have to physically fill out, aside from their conversations they have with the legal and service department, is that when they have a child abuse case and they're required to begin filling out information and details, they fill out what's called a client intake or CSA questionnaire. So I'll just kind of hold that up to the camera right there. And this is a fairly recent...
I'll come to your rescue. I'm going to make you full screen.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
everyone,
There we go. So this is called a client intake. Let me back it up a little bit so we're slightly in focus there. So client intake CSA questionnaire. Now this is just page 1. And it's a multi-page form with extensive information, and obviously all of this information gets entered into Watchtower's database. But the very first thing that it says is attorney-client privilege and confidentiality notice. So that's the first big box at the very top. The information requested below will enable Watchtower Legal Department to provide legal advice to the congregation and others who share a common interest with the congregation. The information will also enable the legal department to jointly defend the congregation, Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of New York, and or Christian Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses should litigation arise. To preserve attorney-client confidentiality, this form must not be shared with anyone except the legal department. If questions arise, please call the legal department at, and then it has the legal department phone number. And then it goes on to explain the whole procedure. And I mean, it's just an extensive procedure of who they need to speak to. And like I say, this particular one is a very recent form. So I'm not showing the public something that's old. And I think I posted a link to this in one of my recent JW survey articles. If necessary, I can comment in the comment section and provide a link to it.
I also mentioned earlier, Mark, about the fact that it actually says in the Elders Manual that the S77 is to be shared with Watchtower. And just to be clear on that, it's actually in chapter 16.31. It says the Judicial Committee should promptly inform the Service Department of the disfellowshipping using the notification of disfellowshipping or disassociation form. So the whole purpose of the S77 is for the information to get forwarded on to Watchtower. And again, you have there in that filing paragraph proof that not only are they keeping a confidential file at the Kingdom Hall, but they're also keeping this S77 form that gets forwarded onto Watchtower. So it's right there in black and white if you know where to look. Yeah. Notification by secular authorities. From time to time, secular authorities may inform the others that a sex offender is living in the area. The notice may provide the address of the individual and may state the nature of his criminal activity. In such a case, the elders should list that address on the appropriate congregation territory as a do not call. I guess here's my main problem with this, other than the fact that it just seems so, oh yeah, it feels lazy to me that that's their way of dealing with the issue. Oh, stick them on the do not call list. But there's a practical concern here as well, Mark, which is that I can still vividly remember, going house to house in the preaching work. And at the beginning of the preach, let's say it's a morning meeting, and they hand out the do not call. They say, you're working Jones Street. Here's your do not calls. And you'll write them down. And inevitably, you'll get into a conversation. You'll be engrossed in conversation. And you'll get into the rhythm of going from one door to the next door to the next door to the next door. And you will call on the do not call. It just happens all the time. It is not just having the list doesn't mean that witnesses, and especially when witnesses don't know that the list is also being used to protect the congregation from pedophiles because they don't have access to this information. It's one thing thinking, oh, well, the worst case scenario is that we're going to get an angry person. They don't know that actually the worst case scenario is that while they're calling with little Jimmy, a monster answers the door. They don't know that because they don't have access to this information. Minors who engage in sexual misconduct with one another are not generally considered by the congregation as having engaged in child sexual abuse. It still seems to be assuming that minors can consent to sex. And one thing that you do hear about is when a victim creates victims themselves. So they're a child sex abuse victim. Let's say they're 16, 17 years old, and then they go on to molest, let's say, an infant because of they've had this kind of behavior normalized. How how would this sort of dismissive language translate to that kind of situation?
Boy, Lloyd, we'd be here all night if I told you how many cases in my own congregation alone involved young people who were sexually abused and then transferred that abuse to other young people. It happened over and over and over again. It was all handled internally.
Here's one for those of you who follow my Fade Interrupted series that I referred to earlier, in which elders have been showing up on people's doorsteps. If the accused does not make himself available to receive an oral invitation despite repeated efforts by the Judicial Committee, then the Judicial Committee should send a written invitation. So we've had camera footage of elders repeatedly calling on individuals, and that's because they're going through these steps. They have to deliver an oral invitation, and once they've exhausted those efforts, they then have to try and deliver a written invitation. But what's interesting, and I intend to bring this up or add this to future editions of my book about how to escape from Jehovah's Witnesses, is it says if they are unsuccessful in their diligent efforts to invite him and they cannot confirm that he received the invitation, they should hold the matter in abeyance. So for me, Cliff, that's interesting. What it's saying is, if you know they're after you, leave. Basically, go on the run, but make it so that they can't think that they can. Basically, don't let them think that they can just stick a letter through your door and you'll receive it. They need to know that you've gone, but not know where you've gone.
The first thing I thought about when I heard this was check your WhatsApp settings. Make sure that there's no read receipt on your iPhone, because if they know that you've read it, in theory, they can say, well, they got the invitation. So if, try to make it so that they can't ever confirm that.
Because in the escape book that I wrote, I talk about the fact that one possible get out clause or one possible way of dealing with a judicial committee is to cite mental health problems or depression. And here you have a remarkable paragraph that basically tells elders, look, if they threaten suicide, basically muddle through. Suspend the hearing, but suspend it based on showing them scriptures and Bible-based publications, and keep the momentum going so that you can eventually steer them back into the judicial committee setting. In other words, don't give up.
Right, exactly. Restore their mental health to the point where they're competent to stand trial, essentially.
Yeah, basically.
That's basically how it is. But at the end of the day, you still don't lose sight of the goal, which is to follow through on this committee and disfellowship if necessary.
Legal action is still fairly straightforward. If the accused threatens legal action against the elders should suspend proceedings and promptly telephone the legal department. In other words, our organization could potentially be sued and lose money. Let's just stop everything. Someone might commit suicide. Well, we'll work around that, Right. So here is a very interesting paragraph, which I actually tweeted about. And this, for me, sums up the entire approach to judicial proceedings against individuals. This paragraph, for me, shows that the odds are stacked against you and the scales of justice are uneven. Because I hadn't even really thought about the possibility of trying to prove yourself innocent in these situations. My understanding when I was an elder, Cliff, was a judicial committee, and I never, fortunately, was asked to sit on a judicial committee in my 1 year as an elder. But my understanding was that it was all about finding out whether people were repentant or not. Right. We've already discovered that you're guilty. What we now want to find out is whether you're repentant, and then we'll know whether to disfellowship you or reprove you. So it wasn't even a consideration for me that in these meetings that there's even a possibility to prove that you're innocent. But indeed there is. But look at the wording. In the rare event that testimony presented during the hearing causes the Judicial Committee to conclude that the matter should not be handled judicially, the hearing should be suspended. Inform the person that he will be contacted further regarding the matter. The body of elders should then be consulted to determine whether the Judicial Committee ought to be disbanded. A Judicial Committee being disbanded is almost unthinkable, and that's for the reasons I've stated, that they've already decided that you're guilty.
Right.
I suppose they've realized that they have to at least consider the possibility that you'll turn up at the Judicial Committee with concrete evidence that you've actually not done the thing that they've accused you of.
Right.
Given how dubious their evidence gathering processes are.
Exactly.
But it's saying that it would be a rare event for this to happen. So again, the scales of justice are weighed against you.
Part of me, I have a feeling that this is something that came up during one of those large elder meetings where an elder raised their hands like, hey, what if this happens? You know, it's hard for me to imagine this is even something that's actually taking place. But, you know, you never know. I was going to point out one thing, though, that I think for me, it's the first example of this that we're considering on this live stream in the middle of that paragraph where it says, inform the person that he will be contacted further regarding the matter. This is one of many examples in this book where you're not supposed to tip your hand, so to speak, or you're not supposed to let the accused wrongdoer know what's actually going on. You know, we're going to look at other examples, but it'll say, you know, if this happens, only tell the person this, and then go and do all of this other stuff. Go talk to all these other people, but don't, you know, let them know that that's what's going on. So it's a very secretive, you know, even in the way that the elders are directed to deal with that person once they're already in the hearing.
Move him to demonstrate sufficient repentance. Their efforts to lead him to repentance. Well, either you're sorry or you're not. This, to me, seems to be describing coercion. I can see that. At times, complicated judicial cases may necessitate consultation with an experienced elder in another congregation or the circuit overseer. In such a situation, inform the wrongdoer that the decision is pending. Do not inform him that you will be consulting with parties outside of the Judicial Committee, which may at times include the branch office. So we were talking earlier about clergy penitent privilege. Well, here you have an open admission that it's fair game. You know, any number of people could be involved. But also, you were mentioning earlier, Cliff, about how unfair it is that people are kept in the dark. And this is deliberately saying, keep them in the dark, don't inform them.
Exactly. So when you go before a judicial committee and these three men know your business and possibly other elders, well, you may find out later at a circuit, or you may not find out, but you may not realize, is what I meant to say. You might be at a circuit assembly later and say hi to some elder in another congregation, and he may know the whole story too, because they've consulted with him, in harmony with what they're told to do in this book. So it's not, this whole thing about confidentiality is, it's disingenuous at best.
Those serving on a judicial committee should endeavor to be unanimous in their decision. And then at the end, if the committee is unable to reach a unanimous conclusion, the minority should give support to the decision reached by the majority. So even if it's a wrong decision, what matters is that it's unanimous.
Right. Exactly. It doesn't look like there's a provision for like they just couldn't reach a conclusion. And when you look at the consequences and the fallout from a judicial committee, to think that the conclusion could be reached in such a frivolous way is just, very disheartening.
For example, in a case of adultery, an innocent mate may lean toward forgiveness, but is not ready to resume sexual relations at the time the judicial committee concludes the case. Again, this is a mandate for elders to ask the question, have you been having sex? Paragraph 2 in this point, the judicial committee has specific reasons to believe that the congregation needs to be on guard concerning the repentant wrongdoer. For example, in a case involving child sexual abuse, announcing the reproof of a repentant wrongdoer will serve as a protection for the congregation. How will this serve as a protection to the congregation if all the congregation gets is name of person has been reproved? How does that protect the congregation?
Yeah, just go to chapter 12 that we just reviewed, and pick your serious sin, basically, and it could, that announcement could involve any of those things. So there's really not any legitimate way to say that that's going to make people think, oh, you know what, I should probably keep my kids away from that person. Maybe
you are reproved instead of disfellowshipped, and you might think, well, I've navigated my way through this and I'm home free. Not necessarily, because in point 24, it says, generally, once a case has been concluded, no further judicial action would be taken. However, as an exception, the case might be reopened if within a few days of the decision, new information comes to light that strongly indicates that the wrongdoer was not genuinely repentant. So you need to be on guard when you walk out of that judicial committee, that within a few days you don't give them another reason, or that they don't come up with another reason within a few days.
Right.
Sorry. Yeah, it's talking here about someone who doesn't attend the judicial hearing. And it says, elders should not leave such confidential information on an answering machine or voicemail, or send it by way of email, text message, or other forms of electronic messaging. In other words, if you do miss your judicial hearing, the only way you're going to find out what the result was is by word of mouth. Either they they're physically in front of you in person, or they manage to get hold of you on the phone, or someone tells you about it. They're not going to email you or text you and confirm. And presumably you would want to know one way or the other, but they're specifically instructed not to do that. So further levels of secrecy here. I did actually uncover some interesting stuff in this chapter, Cliff. I don't know whether you did, but
yes, definitely. Yeah. May I just say one thing before we get started with it?
You may.
There's not a single scripture cited in this entire chapter, as it was not in the prior edition of this book. I'm just,
isn't that interesting?
Just throw that out there for any.
Isn't that interesting?
Talking about the Bible.
You would just have assumed that a book by Watchtower, laying down rules on people's lives, would be strewn with scriptures. You wouldn't be able to move for them. But yeah, I suppose now you mention it. Gosh, right. Here's an interesting thing, Cliff. Paragraph 8, first sentence. The appeal committee may find that while the original basis for disfellowshipping was invalid, other valid grounds for disfellowshipping exist. In other words, they may not have been able to get you on that one thing, but hey, they can get you on something else while they've got you.
Right. Exactly.
How is that remotely fair? The reason why you're having your life dissected to begin with is because they got you on a mistaken understanding. Right. And while they've got you there, while they're poring over your life in detail, that no one's poring over their lives in detail to find things wrong. While they're looking for things that you've done wrong, they've found something else.
Right.
Amazing.
Exactly. So, be careful what you say. If you happen to throw in something about, and I had a drink, they might be like, tell us more about that. How many people were there and how many times did this happen? It wasn't, if they can find something else, they can literally just kind of say, well, he should be disfellowshipped for this, even though it wasn't the original reason.
If the Judicial Committee agrees not to disfellowship the individual, the Appeal Committee should inform him of the final decision. If the Judicial Committee agrees. If the Judicial Committee does not agree with the conclusions, he should be invited back in the room and the Appeal Committee should inform him that further consideration is needed. You're reading this and you're thinking, hang on, they don't have authority. They have to go back to the Judicial Committee and get their approval, and only if the Judicial Committee agrees with their decision can a final decision be reached. And then at the end of paragraph 14, we find out where the book stops. The branch office will thereafter provide written direction to assist both committees with bringing the case to a conclusion. After the two committees have considered the observations of the branch office and made a final decision, the original committee should inform the person involved. Basically, what's the point of the Appeal Committee? They don't get to render a final decision. If the Judicial Committee effectively vetoes their decision, it all goes back to the branch office, and the branch office gets to look over it all over again and make their own decision, which is final. Why have an Appeal Committee? Why not cut out the middleman and go straight to the branch office?
Exactly. Right.
It's farcical.
Yeah, just trying to create some sort of false impression of again, fairness and everything kind of being done on the up and up. And again, I will emphasize that this is another example of don't tell the person what's going on. Just, hey, this will be taken care of soon, but we still need to go over some things. So you just continually kept in the dark as to what's going on. But yes, it does definitely appear that the appeals committee is almost like a waste of time. And if you talk to people, and I don't know about your own experience, but I've not really heard of anyone who's, gotten their disfellowshipping over to maybe one time, I've heard of it, but it's definitely very uncommon.
It says, if an individual is determined to disassociate himself, then the committee ought to prepare a summary of the alleged offences and the evidence of such. This would be kept along with information regarding the disassociation. If the person later requests reinstatement, these matters would need to be considered with him at that time. There's no way of getting away from this organization, Cliff, without them keeping information on you.
Exactly. And so even though supposedly the process is supposed to stop of the Judicial Committee, once someone says that, they're still going to keep in mind and keep in the file the reasons why it was brought in the first place. And then, as it's saying, if you try to come back, they're going to be like, yeah, we know you technically disassociated yourself, but what about all of this stuff that you were originally brought in for? Like, what's going on with all of that kind of stuff, So, yeah, you're right. There's no, and if you go to another congregation, if you're trying to come in through another congregation, they have access to all of that information as well. So, your life is an open book.
Willingly and unrepentantly accepting blood. If someone willingly and accepts a blood transfusion, perhaps because of being under extreme pressure, a committee, not judicial, should obtain the facts and determine the individual's attitude. If he is repentant, the committee would provide spiritual assistance in the spirit of Galatians. The committee may also need to arrange for an announcement to the congregation at a midweek meeting. The elders have handled a matter having to do with name of person. You will be glad to know that spiritual shepherds are endeavoring to render assistance. On the other hand, if the elders on the committee determine that he is unrepentant, not sorry for saving his life, they should announce his disassociation. It's just obvious, isn't it, that this has been moved here from the disfellowshipping requirements. Because they don't want to be seen to be disfellowshipping people for saving their own life. So they've instead, in a very petty way, said, oh, well, instead consider it as them saying they no longer want to be a Jehovah's Witness. Well, it clearly doesn't follow that just because you accept a blood transfusion, you don't want to be a Jehovah's Witness anymore.
Right. And if you look at even, the announcement, that's basically a public reproof. They're not calling it a public reproof. If you say, what was I thinking? I can't believe I saved my life with a blood transfusion. But they say the matter, and I've heard this announcement before. I don't know if it was about a blood transfusion, but I've heard this announcement from a platform that the elders have handled a matter having to do with this person. So like, no matter what, you're not, getting away with that. And we should also, just so everybody's crystal clear, point out the fact that the disfellowshipping announcement and the disassociation announcement are the same announcement. Okay.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
So such and such is no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses. So and the effect is exactly the same. It's not like you go to your family and be like, oh, but I got a blood transfusion. So technically, it doesn't matter. Once the announcement is made that you're no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses, whether it was, sexual immorality, receiving a blood transfusion, Christmas, major gambling, whatever you want to call it, the results are all the same. And this is the type of stuff that I really hope that people begin to key in on when they feel that this organization is harmless. Because when you have people saving their lives successfully, saving their lives with blood transfusion, and then being rewarded or disciplined with family estrangement, it's hard to imagine. It's hard for me to imagine that people wouldn't be appalled by that.
A brief summary of the case should be prepared and signed by the committee, and the notification of disfellowshipping or disassociation S77 form should be filled out and submitted to the service department. We are going to keep records on you, even though you think you've walked away.
Right.
And I mentioned just a moment ago that the consequences for saving your life and not being sorry are even more severe because it's a disassociation offense. And here's the reason why. Point 6. Since disassociation is an action taken by the publisher rather than the committee, there is no arrangement for an appeal.
Right.
So it's worse. And point 6 says the committee should be careful to allow sufficient time. Again, this is going into the procrastination. Perhaps many months, a year, or even longer for a disfellowshipped or disassociated person to demonstrate that he is genuinely repentant. I've put in my notes, on what Bible basis? Where's your scripture that says it needs to be many months, a year, or even longer? What Bible verse says that?
Mm-hmm. Right. And during all that time, as we've talked about, there's no consideration given to how this is likely affecting that person, their mental health, their emotional stability, any of those things. It's just like, just push it out, push it out and use your own judgment, which is not based on any training or anything, any sensitivities towards what that person might be going through.
This was interesting. It's a law, a provision for clapping permission, I'd like to call it.
Mm-hmm.
When it's announced that they've been reinstated, there may be spontaneous, dignified applause when the announcement is made. We permit you to clap.
Right. And I've actually addressed this. I've addressed this on my channel because that's changed. I believe this is actually flip-flopped, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
And they've given specific, directions one way or the other. And it just really goes to show to what degree the lives of Jehovah's Witnesses are micromanaged, applause. How can something like that be policed?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I found this one interesting. So this is obviously a chapter that lays out what the rules are for conducting a meeting. And I don't know about you, Sherry, but I love this part in the section Memorial and Special Talk, where it's talking about selecting a memorial speaker, and it needs to be someone who's, top notch, a really good speaker. And then it says the primary concern of the elders when selecting a speaker should be the quality of the talk. And I've put in my notes, why not the same standard for JW Broadcasting? Why is the memorial talk? Oh, well, they need to be a good speaker, but JW Broadcasting is, well, what rank do they have? Are they a governing
Yes.
body member, or are they a governing body helper? And actually, not just a governing body helper, but preferably someone who works next to David Splain or another governing body member. Then you're a shoe-in for the JW Broadcasting episodes.
Yeah, it's not a consistent criteria, is it?
Indeed. So it's saying here that JW Stream seems to be like the medical holographic program of Kingdom Halls. So if there isn't like a qualified brother who can give a talk, it's JW. Fire up JW Stream, and we'll have a pre-prepared, pre-recorded talk by someone probably at Bethel who's doing this the way it should be done. And they have JW Stream kind of on standby for if there aren't suitable speakers to give either the memorial talk or the special talk. And I love the bit here where it says, if possible, backup speakers should be assigned in case of technical problems with the recordings of the memorial of the special talk. And in my notes, I've put, you're not good enough to give the talk, but please prepare it anyway.
That's right, exactly. Just in case of technical problems. It's hilarious.
Please devote hours to preparing something that we don't think you're capable of doing, just in case our emergency speaker program fails us.
Yeah.
Congregation meetings should not be made available to a wide audience on the internet. Neither should recordings of congregation meetings be distributed indiscriminately. However, it is not necessary to monitor who has access to congregation meetings. So just like another level there of secrecy, you would think that if this is life-saving information, they'd be thrilled that it would get the largest possible distribution. But, ultimately, I think at some level they understand that it's mostly quite embarrassing to outsiders.
It is quite embarrassing, but it also allows there has to be approval for someone to be part of this, that you can't just view it. You've got to meet criteria.
Speaking of criteria, there's quite a lot of criteria for people who help with sign language. And there's a whole section on interpreter attire, which really speaks to the obsession with appearance. No distracting jewelry, watches, or clothing should be worn, and long and brightly painted fingernails should be avoided. Solid colored clothing that contrasts with the interpreter's skin tone. Does it contrast with your skin tone? And here's the motherlode here, weaving in the whole theme that Sherry's been keeping up. Head coverings.
Yeah, this was a fascinating paragraph, and it got me totally confused because at the beginning of the paragraph, you have to have a head covering. No, sorry, I'll just say it right. Sister's use of a head covering in some circumstances is not necessary, since all in attendance should be able to appreciate that she's not actually conducting the meeting. Okay, but then they seem to undo that comment, because it then says that if she's interpreting comments from the audience, student assignments presented by sisters or demonstrations, no head covering required. However, if a well-qualified sister must be used to interpret talks given by brothers, prayers, or songs, she should wear a head covering, even though they just said that you'd appreciate she's not actually conducting the meeting. So to me, it seemed like a head covering show of, oh, it's a sister, don't need head covering. Oh, no, it's a brother, need to put the head covering back on. I mean, what a farce.
Yeah. I think it's summed up, in fairness, in what it says down here in paragraph 34, where it says, since she would not be situated prominently, as would an interpreter for those who are deaf only, she would not need to use a head covering in this instance. So, I don't know, Sherry, it seems to me that it's all down to prominence. And
it is, and visibility.
You forgive me for assuming that it's almost as though they don't want sisters to be prominent.
Oh, well, Lloyd, I don't know how you come to that conclusion. I mean, even as they say in 33, if a well-qualified must be used to interpret. So in other words, if there's not a brother available and oh dear, you're scraping the bottom of the barrel and you have to actually use a sister.
Yeah. So look, if you're watching this as a Jehovah's Witness and you don't know what this scam is all about, first of all, watch the Unrighteous Riches video. Second of all, I'm going to show you some paragraphs now that highlight the hypocrisy of this, because basically it all boils down to who owns a kingdom hall. Who owns it? If you own a kingdom hall, then you should be able to decide what happens in that kingdom hall. If Watchtower owns the kingdom hall, then they should be able to decide what happens, but they should also be paying for the damn thing, because it's their building and because they will pocket the proceeds when it gets sold, which it almost certainly will be sold if Watchtower stands to benefit. So it all boils down to ownership. Now let's look at this section 2 here. And this is where we see how many congregations can be sharing one kingdom hall. A kingdom hall is dedicated to the worship of Jehovah. As many as 3 or 4 congregations. 4 congregations may be assigned by the branch office to use the same kingdom hall auditorium in order to make full use of the facility and to keep expenses to a minimum. This again is their non-construction alternative master plan. We're not going to build halls, we're going to sell them, and we're going to cram multiple congregations into single kingdom halls. Now look at this section here. This is talking about a contact congregation on behalf of these 3 or 4 congregations that deals with the legal and property and related matters. Usually, this contact congregation holds the documents related to the kingdom hall and the property on which it is located. This is for practical reasons only and does not provide a basis for the contact congregation to make unilateral decisions related to the use and upkeep of the kingdom hall, regardless of who holds title. No congregation should conclude that it owns the kingdom hall. It is the responsibility of all the congregations using the property to care for it and see that it is used in harmony with kingdom interests. So Watchtower is here plainly saying, don't you dare for a moment think that just because you're picking up all the bills and meeting there all the time, that you own the kingdom hall. They're not saying, actually, we own it, but that's what they may as well be saying. Compare that, Sherry, with paragraph 13, which is dealing with a scenario in which a congregation might need to rent someone else's facilities and figure out how to. So they need to decide whether any repairs need to be done to make the place safe and suitable. And then it says, bearing in mind this is someone else's facilities now, it says it is best to have the owner of the property care for such work. So
it's fantastic, isn't it?
I mean, the irony there is just beautiful. And how can you not see straight through that? When it's convenient for Watchtower, the owner doesn't have to do the pay for the upkeep, pay for the maintenance. The people who they've duped into thinking they might be the owners, I don't know. But no, when it's the rental accommodation, oh well, they're the owners, they care for the maintenance and upkeep.
It really is astonishing. It sort of struck the whole landlord versus tenant situation, but they're spinning it the way they want to fit their circumstances. What amazes me is that elders who are aware of this don't see it for what it is. I find that incredible.
Major renovation and new construction. The branch office prepares and maintains a master plan. There's that word. A non-constructions alternative master plan that indicates where kingdom halls are needed. I've put, it should say the branch office prepares and maintains a master plan that dictates which kingdom halls can be sold to free up cash for Watchtower. That's essentially what it's all about.
Yes, that's right.
The benefits of merging or consolidation may include improved meeting attendance, higher quality meetings, better distribution of experienced brothers, and a reduction in the number of kingdom halls needing to be constructed. And I've put "and more dollars for Watchtower," which is what it's really all about. Oh, I love this at the end here. The branch office will handle the sale of Kingdom Hall property whenever this is deemed necessary. Look, don't worry yourselves with all of that stress and all of that aggravation about who's going to sell the Kingdom Hall. You just pile that, all that pressure, pile it on us, brothers. We will relieve you of that burden. It's really
a loving arrangement, Lloyd.
It is.
Yeah, exactly. And then another one, just in reference to eagerness to call the authorities, is in paragraph, I think it's at 31, about property damage. Quick action can go far in preventing further damage. It should be promptly reported to local authorities.
Yes, we need to highlight that one. Good call, Sherry. Yeah, so prompt action.
That one there. Yeah.
Yeah, quick action can go far. It certainly can in preventing child abuse, but let's prioritize the building, shall we?
That's it. The message again comes across that when it's Watchtower protecting its assets and its property, yes, quick action can go far to prevent further damage. Let's act quickly, brothers. Break-in, thefts, arson. We should be promptly reporting that to the local authorities. Why can we not apply the same rule to children? Why can you not be saying when damage to children occurs, quick action can go further to prevent further damage? Report promptly to local authorities. How hard would it be to say that?
And you might know more about this. I don't know whether, to what extent you were involved, to what extent JW Broadcasting overlapped with your time in the organization, if at all.
So only just. So
only just.
Our last meeting was in June 2015. So the broadcast started 6 to 9 months before that. I remember trying to watch them, but this arrangement wasn't yet in place. That's in paragraph 41. It's
an interesting one, though, isn't it? Because it's almost but not quite an extra meeting is what I read from it. You can have an extra meeting that multiple, if it's one Kingdom Hall being shared by multiple congregations, it seems like almost a time when they can all come together. Basically a social event, but they all have to dress as they would for a congregation meeting.
Yes.
And disfellowshipped or disassociated ones can attend so that they can be shunned at the back as they would at a normal meeting.
Yes.
It's a bizarre situation, isn't it? Yeah. Look, the proof of the database is right here in the Shepherd Book if you know where to look.
Yep.
And it says here, judicial files and other confidential reports. A brief summary of the proceedings is prepared and signed by the elders involved. The summary should be prepared regardless of the outcome of the meeting. For example, if the case was dismissed because of lack of evidence, the summary should include only pertinent facts and the final determination of the person standing in the congregation. So this is a database that's being kept at the Kingdom Hall. It also says any personal note should be destroyed, which is surely potentially at least the destruction of criminal evidence.
Yep, absolutely. Yep. And I keep thinking about these comments that they're making to privacy and freedom of information regulatory bodies that they hold no data. It's clearly a lie. Because here's all the evidence that they are keeping information.
So imagine you are, let's say you're a 19 a 19-year-old baptized Christian, there we are, when a baptized Christian who is 19 years of age or older, and you want to go to Bethel, please, Elder Williams, I'd like to go to Bethel. Okay, son, well, here's what we'd like. In addition to providing the prospective applicant the application for volunteer program A19 and its cover letter, or the application to become a member of the Worldwide Order of Special Full-Time Servants of Jehovah's Witnesses and its cover letter, be sure to provide him with the A63 letter regarding pornography. I want to go to Bethel. Well, here's a letter about porn for you to read. Honestly, what problems are they having there where that's the first thing they give people? You know? But contrast that. Pull yourself together, Sherry. This is a professional live stream, for goodness sake. Contrast
when you're
that.
Discussing that like that, how can you?
Contrast that with, okay, I don't want to go to Bethel, but I am rather interested in helping Watchtower increase its property portfolio by building it things. Okay, well, things are a little bit different. The aforementioned instructions regarding applications do not apply to exemplary publishers who complete the local design construction volunteer application. We're not going to make you read the porn thing if you want to build us things.
Yes, that's right.
Gosh.
Yeah, it's insane.
So imagine you are a Jehovah's Witness and you want to do public witnessing outside a train station. And so and the train station says, well, that's fine, but here's an application procedure that you need to go through. And it says, any application to use a mobile cart or to set up a table or kiosk to display literature must be filled out in the name of an individual publisher, not in the name of the congregation, any corporation used by the organization, or Jehovah's Witnesses. And stressing that this is all about liability. You have the word there at the bottom, liability. It's all about, we want to protect ourselves. We want it to be clear that you are doing this under your own initiative and not because we've manipulated you into thinking that if you don't do this, you're going to die at Armageddon. But then take a look at paragraph 9. Bear in mind, this is all being done on the individual's name. It's very clearly here, the equipment will remain the property of the congregation.
Yep, exactly.
So
that's right.
When it suits them, it's the cart is the congregation's property, but the individual has to take the hit in terms of liability. You have, again, the hypocrisy of setting up or targeting universities when the organization has positioned itself firmly against higher education. You have the targeting of nursing homes and retirement homes, which amounts to exploitation and gaining a captive audience. Do not meddle in personal matters. There it is. And so that's a bit hypocritical, isn't it? And
well, considering that this whole book is a delve into meddling in everybody's personal matters, it's incredibly hypocritical.
And then it says, spiritual shepherds promote a loving, family-like spirit in the congregation by being trustworthy friends who are known to maintain confidentiality. So again, a bit of a red flag there in terms of how much power elders have and can abuse. Recognizing spiritual weakness might as well be retitled Recognizing People Who Are PMO, or physically in, mentally out, because Watchtower thinks that you are spiritually weak, as evidenced by you neglecting daily Bible reading, personal study, or attendance at congregation meetings. The solution given there in paragraph 8 is to pray the doubts away. Pray for Holy Spirit, read the Bible daily, study Christian publications, and so on.
And be willing to be told, yeah. And that last line, being willing to accept spiritual help from those taking the lead. So it's all about your attitude too, and accepting what you're told.
Yeah. So this is probably very worthwhile taking a look at if you, again, are in this very precarious situation of having to live a pretense. This tells you how the elders are instructed to handle you, basically. Giving effective counsel was interesting. I love the part here where it says elders should base their expressions on the Bible and Bible-based publications, not their opinion. We have had, Sherry, in this book, entire chapters devoid of Bible references.
Yep, that's exactly right.
So more fixation in part 11 about scriptural divorce. If the Christian is contemplating divorce, the elder should explain that a legal divorce of itself does not free an individual to remarry. That again is connected to domestic violence and is the main reason or the main obsession that causes abused women and abused husbands to be kept in that situation. This again applies. I was saying before about PIMO and the way Watchtower treats PIMO people. Here you have assisting inactive ones. Active ones, yeah. This sentence here, Sherry, seems to suggest to me that this assistance involves stalking.
Yes, that is what it is. It's quite blatantly stalking.
Elders have the responsibility to search diligently. Can you imagine if you use that as a defense in a court of law because you were actually being prosecuted for actually stalking someone, let's say a celebrity, and no, Your Honor, it's all been a huge misunderstanding. I was searching diligently for Miley Cyrus. That's all it was.
It's also harassment. It's harassment.
Yeah.
Leave us alone.
A visit, a telephone call, or a letter can accomplish much good, apparently. So, news to me.
I'm still waiting for one.
Yeah. Here's another don't ask, don't tell, Sherry, which really had me scratching my head. An inactive one who has been involved in serious wrongdoing and desires to return to the congregation may feel that if he confesses his wrongdoing to the elders, he will be disfellowshipped, but he will not be expelled from the congregation if he has discontinued the unscriptural practice and is genuinely repentant.
Yeah, it's quite bizarre, that one.
I've never heard of that before.
No.
That's don't ask, don't tell. Keep it to yourself. And you'll be better off because many years have gone by and we all know what a difference many years can make.
But the thing is, an inactive one isn't even going to know about that information.
Exactly.
Isn't going to know that paragraph is there.
Yeah. That's not in the Return to Jehovah brochure, as far as I'm aware.
No, that's
in fact,
right.
if anything, the Return to Jehovah brochure is guilt-tripping people into thinking they need to confess all their sins and potentially be disfellowshipped for what they've been up to. I like this last part. Of course, contact should not be made with active apostates, with those who are trying to lead others into sin, or with those who have made it known that they want nothing to do with the Christian congregation. So unkind. I feel slightly... I feel put out by that, Sherry.
Weddings.
Surely there can't be too many rules and regulations surrounding something as simple and beautiful and joyous as a wedding. I'm sure they wouldn't have a provision along the lines of ask them if they've had sex. Oh,
exactly.
This is awkward.
That's right.
So an elder's been asked to preside at the wedding, meet with the couple to make tactful but straightforward inquiries about their conduct during courtship. So romantic.
It just seems that there is a very over-eager desire to, do we need a judicial committee? Can we get one? Is there something we can act on here? And almost disappointed if there isn't.
Yeah. They're perverts, aren't they? Let's face it.
Yeah. And then in the next point, which I'm sure you're going to bring out, it's again their right to establish whether there is scriptural freedom to remarry. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That pops up again. Here that they're obsessed, completely obsessed with this, with adulterous marriage and scriptural freedom to remarry. It's all throughout the book. Look at this part though on point 4. Those who are engaged to be married are in particular need of shepherding by loving elders. And I just put, on what basis? The only thing I can think of why you would think that there's a particular need is because you're obsessed with sex and whether or not there has been any sex that you haven't been involved in some way. That seems to be. And when you scroll down in the paragraph, here we go. This is where it's all coming out. Such prayerful study will strengthen them to remain chaste during courtship. It's all about chastity, isn't it?
Yep. It's all about repression.
And having your wedding reception planned for you, because if they are planning a wedding reception, they should be reminded to review the latest material published by the faithful slave.
Correct.
I also loved this part here where there's literally a no joking clause for the wedding speaker.
Yes.
So the speaker, if you've ever been at a JW wedding and you've wondered why it's so hopelessly tedious, it's because the speaker literally is prohibited from cracking jokes. The speaker should resist the temptation to make funny remarks just for the sake of making the audience laugh, since this could betray a lack of respect for the audience and for God. I'm sure, though, given the fact that they have line dancing at Kingdom Halls and singing Pharrell Williams, what is it, Happy, when they're entertaining international convention delegates inside Kingdom Halls, I'm sure they will be quite relaxed when it comes to what kind of music the couple can have at the wedding.
Oh no, Lord. No.
Oh, sorry, I'm racing ahead here and I've got it all wrong.
You've got it all
any
wrong.
decoration any decoration of the Kingdom Hall or rearrangement of the chairs must be approved by the service committee. Only music from Sing Out Joyfully to Jehovah should be used. The wedding party should not include any disfellowshipped person or anyone whose lifestyle grossly conflicts with Bible principles. That'll be an enjoyable conversation, won't it? Who's in your wedding party?
Oh,
So, just amazing how even with something as joyous as a wedding, they've managed to ruin it.
Yep, absolutely. And if there is any, in the next point, if there is any serious wrongdoing, then the couple can't use the Kingdom Hall. The gossip mill loves that. Yeah.
This is kind of mopping it all up at the end. So basically everything apart from the child abuse stuff, which has its own chapter, they've crammed it all in at the end here. And to sum up the Jehovah's Witness view of legal matters, you have here, in harmony with Matthew 22 and a bunch of other scriptures, the congregation respects the relative authority of secular government. Sherry, that's what it's all about, relative authority. We will follow the law so long as we think the law agrees with God's law.
Exactly. And that's why you have the 2-witness rule and Gary Bro making statements actually, that we'll never get rid of the 2-witness rule, that comes first, because their compliance to secular governments is relative. God's law comes first.
Indeed. So point 1 there, it says the elders receive a request or an order to disclose. This is talking about when you should call the legal department.
Yes.
So the elders receive a request or an order to disclose confidential information such as request from an individual, the authorities, an attorney, or the media. So, Sherry, the police call at a Kingdom Hall and say, we want the contents of your confidential file. And rather than simply saying, rather than simply handing it over, it's 1 minute, officer, I need to jump on the phone. Here's an odd thing in this whole chat, in this whole part here, where it talks about Onesimus, because this is talking about undocumented aliens. The whole section here is how do we deal with people that Donald Trump doesn't like?
Yes, it's bizarre. That's totally bizarre.
How do we?
It was. I was having a surreal experience. Like, what?
Yeah.
Are we dealing with here?
To what extent should they be allowed to be involved, illegal immigrants, in the goings on in a Kingdom Hall? Are they allowed to be elders? Are they allowed to be servants? All of this is laid out in this chapter, or in this section in particular. And there's a really odd thing about Onesimus, because if you know the story of Onesimus was a runaway slave. It's actually a really good example of the Bible talking about slavery in very casual terms, as though it's totally fine. And it says of an illegal immigrant, if he is exemplary in every other way, he may be granted certain additional privileges, just as Paul used Onesimus to a certain extent. To me, it sounds like it's saying, feel free to exploit illegal immigrants.
Yeah, it's just absolutely preposterous. He can assist with cleaning, but may not work with construction. He may comment, may be allowed to pass the microphone and help with literature. It's just absolutely absurd.
I've had this thing where a coordinator has stood on a platform and said there's no such thing as a congregation get-together. And it has it here in the Shepherd book. They should not use terms such as congregation picnic or congregation gathering. And yet I can remember there being some really pleasant congregation get-togethers when I was little, but apparently that was all wrong.
That has to be, there has to be a reason for that. It's got to be a liability issue or something that, if some event happens at a congregation picnic or a congregation gathering, or the congregation can't be responsible for what happens, so therefore not allowed to use the terms. There's got to be a reason for why that's there.
That would make sense. However, I think at least in the case of this guy who said that, or we're talking years ago now, I think he was thinking more in terms of, well, you wouldn't socialize necessarily with everyone who attends our meetings. So therefore, you can't have a blanket get together for everyone who attends our meetings, because do they qualify? Are they good association and all that kind of thing?
Wow.
Yeah, he was that kind of person. And we're going to finish, I think, on child custody, which I know from personal experience, Sherry, is a real issue for. Imagine you wake up to the fact that you have been lied to by Jehovah's Witnesses, and in addition to navigating your way through this whole minefield of issues, of existential crises, you're also having to fight for your children because your spouse is still believing, and it's a very troubling situation to be in. And here it is basically where Watchtower is saying, we will fight for the rights of JWs on the JW side of these situations. If the answers to all of the following questions are yes, call the legal department. And the third and fourth are, is the other party to the litigation not one of Jehovah's Witnesses? And 4, is it evident that the publisher's religious beliefs will be at issue?
Yeah, that's deeply, deeply concerning. And it has to be, I really feel for ones that are in that situation, it's a minefield to be going through that experience. I really feel for ones in that predicament.
So those were my highlights from the live streams reviewing the Shepherd book. Again, if you doubt anything that we were discussing, or you want to check for yourself whether what we were saying is accurate, whether we've summed things up fairly, by all means download this book yourself. A link is in the description. If you feel you'd like to see the live streams unedited, or maybe see what we said in more detail, you can again go to any of the individual videos, and you will notice that I've put timestamps in the descriptions so that you can go straight to the part of the live stream where we're discussing certain parts of the book. So that should make it easier for you to navigate the live streams. But I think it's important that witnesses understand this book better, because there's so many rules and regulations that apply directly to ordinary witnesses that they're just kept in the dark about. So hopefully these live streams and this highlights video will be helpful. But that's about everything I have for you. I do hope you've enjoyed this video. Don't forget to subscribe to the John Cedars channel for more such videos, and as always, thank you for watching.